Dr. Henry Foster stepped out of his rented SUV, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The scent of pine and wild sage filled his nostrils, a stark contrast to the sterile laboratory environment he'd left behind in Chicago. Yellowstone National Park stretched out before him, a vast wilderness teeming with life and danger. As he began unloading his gear, a park ranger approached. "Dr. Foster," the man called out, his voice carrying easily in the quiet of the surrounding forest. Henry turned, offering a smile and an outstretched hand. "That's me. You must be Ranger Thompson." The ranger shook his hand firmly. "Welcome to Yellowstone, Doctor. I understand you're here to study our grizzly population?" "That's right," Henry replied, his enthusiasm evident in his voice. "I'm particularly interested in their foraging patterns and how they're adapting to climate change." Ranger Thompson's expression grew serious. "Well, I hope you're prepared for what you might encounter out there. These aren't the cuddly bears you see in cartoons. They're wild animals and they can be incredibly dangerous." Henry nodded, patting the canister of bear spray attached to his belt. "I've done my research, Ranger. I know the risks." "Good," Thompson said, though his face still held a hint of concern. "Just remember, no research is worth your life. If you see a bear, especially a mother with cubs, give them a wide berth, and make sure you store your food properly. The last thing we need is a bear getting habituated to human food." "Understood," Henry assured him. "I've got a bear-proof canister for my supplies, and I'll be hanging my food bag at night." The ranger seemed satisfied with this response. "All right then. Your permitted campsite is about a mile up this trail. It's a good spot, close enough to bear territory for your research, but not so close that you're likely to have any midnight visitors." As they walked towards the trailhead, Henry couldn't help but notice the beauty of his surroundings. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. "It's beautiful out here," Henry murmured, almost to himself. Thompson smiled. "That it is. Just remember, it's also wild. Nature doesn't care about your research or your good intentions. Out here, you're just another animal trying to survive." With those sobering words, the ranger bid Henry farewell and headed back to his vehicle. Left alone, Henry shouldered his heavy pack and began the hike to his campsite. The trail was well maintained but steep in places, and by the time Henry reached his designated spot, he was breathing heavily and covered in a light sheen of sweat. He dropped his pack with a grateful sigh and took a moment to survey his surroundings. The campsite was a small clearing, ringed by towering pines. A fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by flat rocks that would serve as makeshift seats. To one side, a sturdy metal pole had been erected, the designated spot for hanging food bags out of reach of curious bears. Henry set about making camp with the efficiency of an experienced outdoorsman. He pitched his tent, unrolled his sleeping bag, and organized his gear. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig made him pause and scan his surroundings. "Get a grip, Foster," he muttered to himself. "You're letting Thompson's warnings get to you." As the sun began to set, Henry finished setting up his research equipment. Motion-activated cameras were secured to trees at strategic points around the campsite, ready to capture any nighttime visitors. A small weather station would record temperature, humidity, and wind speed, data that could help correlate bear activity with environmental factors. With his work done for the day, Henry set about preparing his dinner. He fired up his compact camping stove, and soon the smell of rehydrated beef stew filled the air. As he ate, he couldn't help but wonder if the aroma would attract any unwanted attention. The thought had barely crossed his mind when a twig snapped loudly in the forest, beyond the clearing. Henry froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, and strained his ears. For a long moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Then, another snap, closer this time. Henry slowly set down his bowl and reached for his flashlight. His hand was trembling slightly as he flicked it on, sending a beam of light cutting through the gathering darkness. At first, he saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then a flash of movement caught his eye. Something large was moving through the underbrush, just at the edge of his light's reach. Henry's breath caught in his throat, Could it be a bear? Had one been drawn to his campsite by the smell of his dinner? He stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is someone there?" No response came, but the rustling continued. It seemed to be circling the campsite, staying just out of sight. Henry's mind raced with possibilities. A bear would be dangerous, but at least he knew how to handle that situation. But what if it was something else? A mountain lion, perhaps, or even a person with ill intentions. "I'm armed," he lied, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. "I don't want any trouble." Suddenly the rustling stopped. The forest fell eerily silent, not even the chirp of a cricket breaking the stillness. Henry held his breath, flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the tree line. Then, without warning, a massive shape burst from the undergrowth. Henry stumbled backward, a startled cry escaping his lips. His foot caught on a root, and he fell hard, the flashlight flying from his grasp and rolling away, its beam spinning crazily across the clearing. In the frantic moments that followed, Henry caught only glimpses of his visitor, a hulking form, covered in shaggy fur, small, gleaming, eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam, and most terrifyingly, the unmistakable profile of a grizzly bear. The bear let out a low, rumbling growl that Henry felt more than heard. It was a sound of warning, of territorial claim. This was the bear's domain, and Henry was an unwelcome intruder. Remembering his training, Henry slowly got to his feet, making himself appear as large as possible. "Hey, bear," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't mean you any harm, just passing through." The bear swayed on its feet, seeming to consider this strange, two-legged creature before it. Henry's hand inched towards the bear spray, on his belt, ready to deploy it if necessary. For what felt like an eternity, man and bear stood locked in a silent standoff. Then, with a final huff that sent warm, fishy breath washing over Henry, the grizzly turned and lumbered back into the forest. Henry remained frozen in place long after the sound of the bear's departure had faded. His heart hammered in his chest, and he realized his clothes were soaked with cold sweat. Slowly, mechanically, he retrieved his flashlight and swept the beam around the clearing once more. Nothing moved in the shadows. With shaking hands, he quickly gathered up his dinner things and stowed them in the bear canister. He hung his food bag high in the designated tree, movements automatic after years of fieldwork. Only when everything was secure did he allow himself to slump down by the cold fire pit, the reality of what had just happened washing over him. He had come face to face with a grizzly bear on his very first night in Yellowstone. The encounter had lasted only moments, but it had felt like a lifetime. And while a part of him was terrified, another part, the scientist in him, was exhilarated. This was why he had come here after all, to study these magnificent, dangerous creatures up close, to understand their behaviors, their patterns, their very nature. Tonight had been a stark reminder of the risks involved in such research, but it had also reinforced Henry's determination to see his project through. As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion set in. Henry crawled into his tent, zipping it up securely behind him. He knew the thin fabric would offer little protection if the bear decided to return, but it provided at least an illusion of safety. Lying in his sleeping bag, Henry stared up at the tent ceiling, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Every rustle and crack made him tense, wondering if the bear was coming back. But gradually the rhythm of the wilderness, the hooting of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the whisper of wind through the pines, lulled him into a fitful sleep. His last conscious thought before drifting off was a mix of excitement and apprehension. If this was just the first night, what other encounters awaited him in the days to come? Little did he know, his true test of survival was yet to begin. The first rays of dawn filtered through the forest canopy as Dr. Henry Foster emerged from his tent, blinking away the remnants of a restless night's sleep. The memory of his close encounter with the grizzly bear the previous evening still sent shivers down his spine, but it had also ignited a fierce determination within him. He was here to study these magnificent creatures, and he wouldn't let fear deter him from his mission. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong black coffee, Henry packed his day pack with essential gear, his camera, notebook, GPS, device, first aid kit, and plenty of water. He double-checked his bear spray, ensuring it was easily accessible on his belt. With a deep breath, he set off into the wilderness, leaving the relative safety of his campsite behind. The forest was alive with the sounds of the new day. Birds chirped enthusiastically overhead, while small creatures rustled through the underbrush. Henry moved cautiously, his senses on high alert for any sign of large predators. Every snapping, twig or unexpected movement in his peripheral vision made his heart rate spike. As he hiked deeper into bear territory, the terrain became more rugged. The well-maintained trails gave way to rough animal tracks, forcing Henry to navigate carefully, over exposed roots and loose rocks. The physical exertion helped to calm his nerves, allowing him to focus on the task at hand. After about an hour of hiking, Henry came across his first significant sign of bear activity. A young tree had been stripped of its bark, deep claw marks, scarring the trunk. Henry approached cautiously, camera at the ready. Fascinating, he murmured to himself, examining the marks closely. This bear was likely after the cambium layer, nutritious, especially in early spring. He snapped several photos and made detailed notes in his weatherproof notebook. As he worked, a familiar excitement began to build within him. This was why he had come here, to observe and document these incredible animals in their natural habitat. Encouraged by his find, Henry pressed on. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thicker, limiting visibility and increasing the tension in the air. He found himself constantly scanning his surroundings, acutely aware of how quickly a bear could appear in this terrain. It was nearing midday when Henry made his most significant discovery yet. Pushing through a thicket of berry bushes, he suddenly found himself in a small clearing. The sight that greeted him made him freeze in his tracks. At the center of the clearing lay the partially consumed carcass of an elk. Flies buzzed around the remains, and the pungent smell of decay filled the air. But it wasn't the dead elk that captured Henry's attention. It was the massive paw prints in the soft earth around the kill site. "My God," Henry breathed, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "This is fresh, very fresh." With trembling hands, he reached for his camera, determined to document the sight. But as he raised the device to his eye, a twig snapped loudly somewhere to his left. Henry whirled around, his heart pounding. The dense foliage at the edge of the clearing swayed slightly, as if something large had just passed through it. Another. Snap closer this time. "Hey, bear," Henry called out, his voice wavering slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. "I see you there. I'm just passing through. No need for trouble." For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, with a rustle of leaves, a massive grizzly bear emerged from the underbrush. It stood on its hind legs, easily towering over Henry at nearly 9 feet tall. Its small eyes fixed on the intruder, nostrils flaring as it caught his scent. Henry's mouth went dry. He knew he should make himself look big to shout and try to intimidate the bear. But in that moment, faced with the sheer majesty and power of the creature before him, he found himself rooted to the spot. The bear dropped back to all fours with a thud that Henry felt in his chest. It huffed loudly, pawing at the ground. Was it preparing to charge? "Easy now," Henry said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I'm not here to steal your meal, just let me back away nice and slow." He began to edge backwards, careful not to make any sudden movements. The bear watched him intently, its massive head swaying slightly from side to side. 5 steps. 10. Henry dared to hope he might make it out of this encounter unscathed. Then, without warning, the bear charged. Time seemed to slow down. Henry saw the powerful muscles rippling under the bear's shaggy coat, heard the heavy huffs of its breath, felt the ground shake under its thundering paws. In that eternal moment, a lifetime of training and preparation condensed into a single crucial decision. Henry's hand flew to his belt, grabbing the canister of bear spray. As the grizzly closed the distance between them with terrifying speed, he depressed the trigger, sending a cloud of potent capsaicin spray directly into the oncoming bear's face. The effect was immediate. The bear reared up with a roar of pain and confusion, massive paws swiping at its burning eyes and nose. It staggered backwards, shaking its head violently. Henry didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Branches whipped at his face and arms. Roots threatened to trip him at every step. but terror lent him speed and agility he didn't know he possessed. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled, the bear's pained roars fading behind him. Finally, gasping for breath, he slumped against a large tree, straining his ears for any sign of pursuit. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the reality of what had just happened washed over Henry. He had come face to face with a grizzly bear, again, and this time he had been forced to use his spray. The encounter replayed in his mind, each moment, etched in vivid detail. That was too close, he muttered to himself, running a shaky hand through his sweat-soaked hair. Way too close. As his breathing slowly returned to normal, Henry took stock of his situation. In his panicked flight, he had lost all sense of direction. His GPS device, thankfully still attached to his belt, would help him find his way back to camp. But first he needed to ensure he was out of the bear's territory. With trembling hands, he pulled out his water bottle and took a long drink. The cool liquid helped to clear his head, and he forced himself to think rationally. The bear, disoriented and in pain from the spray, was unlikely to have followed him. Still, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Henry began to make his way carefully back in the general direction of his campsite, all thoughts of further research forgotten for the moment. As he hiked, he reflected on the events of the day. He had come to Yellowstone to study bear behavior, and he had certainly gotten an up-close look at it. But at what cost? The encounter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The raw power and speed of the grizzly, the primal fear he had felt. These were experiences that would stay with him forever. And yet, beneath the lingering fear, a small part of him thrilled at the encounter. He had faced one of nature's most fearsome predators and lived to tell the tale. As the familiar outlines of his campsite came into view, Henry let out a sigh of relief. He had made it back safely. But as he began to unpack his gear, his hands still shaking slightly, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The wilderness of Yellowstone held many more challenges, and he had a sinking feeling that his most harrowing encounters were yet to come. That night, as he lay in his tent listening to the sounds of the forest, Henry's mind raced. The day's events played on loop in his head. The fresh kill site, the sudden appearance of the bear, the heart-stopping moment of the charge. Sleep eluded him, every rustle outside his tent sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. "Get a grip, Foster," he muttered to himself in the darkness. "You knew the risks when you came out here. This is what you signed up for." But as he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, one question lingered in his mind. Was the pursuit of knowledge worth risking his life? Little did he know the coming days would test his resolve to its very limits, forcing him to confront not just the dangers of the wild, but the depths of his own courage and determination. The morning sun filtered through the pine canopy as Dr. Henry Foster emerged from his tent, his muscles aching from the previous day's harrowing encounter. Despite the lingering fear, his scientific curiosity burned brighter than ever. He was determined to continue his research, albeit with heightened caution. After a hearty breakfast of freeze-dried eggs and strong coffee, Henry meticulously checked his gear. He double-checked his bear spray, ensuring it was full and easily accessible. His camera, binoculars, and field journal were safely stowed in his backpack. "Today's the day," he muttered to himself, trying to bolster his courage. "Keep your wits about you, Foster. You're here to observe, not become a statistic." As he set out from his campsite, the forest seemed to come alive around him. Birds chirped overhead, small creatures rustled in the underbrush, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wild sage. Despite the beauty, Henry remained vigilant, his senses on high alert for any sign of bear activity. He hiked for several hours, carefully documenting signs of bear presence: overturned rocks, claw marks on trees, and scat. Each discovery sent a mixture of excitement and apprehension through him. As the day wore on, Henry found himself in a small clearing near a bubbling stream. The sound of running water masked other forest noises, making him increasingly uneasy. He scanned the area carefully before kneeling to refill his water bottle. That's when he heard it, a low rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath him. Henry's blood ran cold. Slowly he raised his head, his eyes widening as he took in the sight before him. Not 20 yards away, stood a massive grizzly bear, its brown fur gleaming in the dappled sunlight. The bear's head was low, its small eyes fixed intently on Henry. Time seemed to stand still. Henry's mind raced, recalling every bit of bear safety training he'd ever received. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Speak calmly but firmly, with trembling. Hands he slowly rose to his full height, arms raised to appear larger. "Hey, bear," he called out, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I see you there. I'm just passing through. No need for trouble." The bear huffed, pawing at the ground. It seemed unsure, perhaps as startled by Henry's presence as he was by its. "That's right," Henry continued, taking a small step backward. "I'm not a threat, just going to back away nice and slow." For a tense moment, it seemed to be working. The bear stopped pawing the ground, its aggressive posture relaxing slightly. Henry dared to hope that this encounter might end peacefully. But fate had other plans. A sudden gust of wind swirled through the clearing, carrying Henry's scent directly to the bear. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The grizzly reared, up on its hind legs, towering over Henry at nearly 9 feet tall. It let out a deafening roar that Henry felt in his very bones. "Oh God," Henry breathed, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The bear dropped back to all fours and began to advance, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. Henry knew he had seconds to act, before the situation became deadly. With shaking hands, he reached for his bear spray. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't want to use this." But the bear kept coming, picking up speed. In that moment, Henry made a split-second decision that would haunt him for days to come. He turned and ran. Every instinct screamed at him that this was wrong, that running would only trigger the bear's predatory response. But terror overrode reason, and Henry found himself crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at his face as he fled. He could hear the bear behind him, its heavy breathing, and the sound of breaking branches spurring him to run faster than he'd ever run before. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but still he pushed on, driven by pure survival instinct. Suddenly his foot caught on an exposed root. Henry went down hard, sprawling face first into the leaf litter. He rolled onto his back, expecting at any moment to feel the bear's claws tearing into him, but the attack never came. Gasping for breath, Henry looked around wildly. The bear was nowhere to be seen. The forest had fallen eerily silent, save for his own ragged breathing. For several long minutes, Henry remained frozen on the ground, straining his ears for any sound of the bear's approach. Gradually, as his heartbeat slowed and his breathing steadied, he began to take stock of his situation. His clothes were torn and dirty from his headlong flight through the forest. His backpack, miraculously still on his shoulders, had protected him from the worst of the fall. But worst of all, he realized with a sinking feeling he had no idea where he was. In his panic, he had run blindly, paying no attention to direction or landmarks. The dense forest looked the same in every direction. "Stupid Foster," he berated himself as he slowly got to his feet, wincing at the various aches and pains making themselves known. Real smart move there. He pulled out his GPS device, relieved to find it undamaged. It would guide him back to his campsite, but first he needed to ensure he was well clear of the bear's territory. As he began to pick his way carefully through the forest, Henry's mind raced. The encounter replayed itself over and over in his head. Why had the bear charged? Had it been defending a food source he hadn't seen, or had his presence simply been an unwelcome intrusion in its territory? These questions, and 1,000 others, swirled in his mind as he hiked. The scientist in him was fascinated, eager to analyze and understand the bear's behavior. But the man in him, the part that had felt primal terror in the face of nature's raw power, was shaken to his core. It was late afternoon by the time Henry finally stumbled back into his campsite. Exhausted, both physically and emotionally, he collapsed onto a log by the cold fire pit. As the adrenaline faded, leaving him drained and trembling, the full weight of the day's events crashed over him. He had come face to face with a grizzly bear. Again. He had run, breaking one of the cardinal rules of bear encounters, and yet, somehow he had survived. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Henry forced himself to eat a small meal and document the day's events in his journal. His hands shook as he wrote, the neat scientific observations giving way to more personal reflections. I've never felt so small, he wrote, so utterly insignificant in the face of nature's power. The bear could have killed me in an instant. Why didn't it? Was it merely curious? Or did my flight trigger its predatory instincts only to lose interest when I fell out of sight? He paused, pen hovering over the page. I came here to study these magnificent creatures, to understand their behavior and their place in this ecosystem. But today I was reminded that I'm not just an observer here. I'm a part of this system too, and a vulnerable one at that. As night fell, Henry retreated to his tent, zipping himself in securely. He knew the thin fabric offered little real protection, but it provided at least an illusion of safety. Sleep was elusive that night. Every sound from the forest outside, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the trees, sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. When he did manage to doze off, his dreams were filled with charging bears and endless chases through a twisted, nightmarish forest. In the quiet hours before dawn, as Henry lay awake listening to the forest come to life around him, he wrestled with a difficult question. Should he continue his research, knowing the very real dangers he faced? Or should he pack up and leave, admitting that the risks were too great? The easy answer, the safe answer, would be to leave, to return to the comfort and security of his lab back in Chicago. But as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through his tent, Henry made his decision. He had come here to study grizzly bears in their natural habitat. He had known the risks going in, and while the encounters of the past 2 days had shaken him, they had also provided invaluable data and experiences. I'm not giving up, he said aloud, his voice firm with renewed determination. I'm going to see this through. As he emerged from his tent to greet the new day, Henry felt a mix of fear and excitement coursing through him. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he was determined to face them head-on. For better or worse, his journey into the heart of grizzly country was far from over. The rising sun cast long shadows through the forest as Dr. Henry Foster emerged from his tent, his face etched with determination. Despite the harrowing encounters of the past few days, he was resolved to continue his research. Today he planned to venture into a new area of the park, one known for its high concentration of grizzly activity. As he packed his gear, Henry ran through his mental checklist. Bear spray check, GPS check, first aid kit check, he muttered, ensuring each item was easily accessible. He paused, holding his camera. The weight of it in his hands reminded him of his purpose here, to document, to learn, to understand, with a deep breath he set out into the wilderness. The forest was alive with the sounds of morning, birds calling, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. Henry moved cautiously, his senses on high alert for any sign of large predators. After several hours of hiking, he came across a small stream cutting through the forest. The sound of running water was soothing, a stark contrast to the tension he'd been carrying. Henry decided this would be a good spot to take a break and refill his water bottle. As he knelt by the stream, movement caught his eye. Across the water, partially hidden by dense foliage, something was stirring. Henry froze, his hand instinctively moving to his bear spray. Then he heard it, a high-pitched squeal, followed by another. His eyes widened as realization dawned. Those weren't the sounds of an adult bear, but cubs. Slowly, carefully, Henry raised his binoculars. Through the lenses, he could make out 2 bear cubs, no more than a few months old, tumbling and playing near the water's edge. Their fur was a rich brown, still fuzzy with youth, and their movements were clumsy yet endearing. Incredible, Henry breathed, his scientific mind already racing. This was a rare opportunity to observe bear cubs in their natural habitat, undisturbed by human presence. Keeping low and moving with utmost caution, Henry retrieved his camera. He knew the risks. Where there were cubs, a protective mother was never far away. But the potential data from this observation was too valuable to pass up. As he watched, the cubs wrestled playfully, occasionally pausing to bat at the water or investigate a particularly interesting rock. Henry's camera clicked softly as he documented their behavior, his excitement growing with each shot. This is groundbreaking, he murmured to himself. their social behaviors, their interactions with the environment, it's all here. So engrossed was he in his observations that he almost missed the sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath him. Henry's blood ran cold. Slowly, he lowered his camera and turned his head. There, not 20 yards away, stood the cub's mother. She was massive, her brown fur bristling as she rose to her full height. Her small eyes were fixed on Henry, filled with unmistakable fury. Time seemed to stand still. Henry's mind raced, recalling every bit of bear safety training he'd ever received. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. Easy now, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not here to hurt your cubs. Just going to back away nice and slow. He began to edge backwards, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The mother bear dropped back to all fours, but her posture remained aggressive. She took a step forward for every step Henry took. Back, the cubs, oblivious to the danger, continued their play. One of them let out a particularly loud squeal, and the mother's head whipped around to check on them. In that split second of distraction, Henry's foot caught on a hidden root. He stumbled, arms windmilling, as he fought to keep his balance. His backpack shifted, the metal frame clanging loudly against a nearby rock. The sound was like a trigger. The mother bear's head snapped back towards Henry, her eyes now filled with pure primal rage. With a roar that seemed to shake the forest itself, she charged. Henry had no time to think, no time to reach for his bear spray. Pure instinct took over and he ran. He crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at his face and arms. He could hear the bear behind him, her heavy breathing and the sound of breaking branches spurring him to run faster than he'd ever run before. "Help!" he screamed, knowing it was futile. There was no one around for miles. "Somebody help me!" His lungs burned, his legs ached, but still he pushed on. He dared not look back, knowing that to do so would mean certain death. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet disappeared. In his blind panic, Henry had run straight off the edge of a small ravine. He tumbled head over heels, bouncing off rocks and roots before landing hard at the bottom. Pain exploded through his body. He tasted blood, felt it trickling down his face. But the fear of the bear overrode everything else, ignoring the protests. Of his battered body, Henry scrambled to his feet and stumbled onward. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. Gasping for breath, he finally dared to look behind him. The bear was nowhere in sight. For several long minutes, Henry remained where he had fallen, straining his ears for any sound of pursuit. Gradually, as his heartbeat slowed and his breathing steadied, he began to take stock of his situation. His clothes were torn and bloodied. His backpack was gone, lost somewhere in his headlong flight. Worst of all, he realized with a sinking feeling he had no idea where he was. "Stupid Foster," he berated himself as he slowly got to his feet, wincing at the various aches and pains making themselves known. "You knew better than to get that close to cubs." He patted his pockets, relieved to find his GPS device still there. It would guide him back to his campsite, but first he needed to ensure he was well clear of the bear's territory. As he began to pick his way carefully through the forest, Henry's mind raced. The encounter replayed itself over and over in his head. He had known the risks of observing cubs, had known how fiercely protective mother bears could be, and yet, in his scientific zeal, he had pushed too far. "I could have died," he muttered. The reality of the situation sinking in, all for a few photographs. It was well past nightfall by the time Henry finally stumbled back into his campsite. Exhausted, battered, and thoroughly shaken, he collapsed onto a log by the cold fire pit. As the adrenaline faded, leaving him drained and trembling, the full weight of the day's events crashed over him. He had come face to face with a mother grizzly protecting her cubs. He had run, tumbled down a ravine, and somehow survived. But at what cost? As he tended to his wounds with the meager first aid supplies, left in his tent, Henry was forced to confront some hard truths. His passion for research had blinded him to the very real dangers he faced. He had pushed too far, taken too many risks. "What am I doing here?" he asked aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet night. "Am I really cut out for this?" Sleep was elusive that night. Every sound from the forest outside sent a jolt of fear through him. When he did manage to doze off, his dreams were filled with charging bears and endless falls down dark ravines. As the first light of dawn began to filter through his tent, Henry made a decision. He would stay one more day to recover and gather his thoughts. Then he would hike back to civilization and reassess his entire project. "I came here to study bears, not become their prey," he said to himself as he emerged from his tent to greet the new day. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, like admitting defeat. But as he looked out at the beautiful yet unforgiving wilderness around him, he knew it was the right choice. Henry Foster had come to Yellowstone to unlock the secrets of grizzly bear behavior. Instead, he had been given a stark reminder of his own vulnerability in the face of nature's raw power. As he began to pack up his campsite, he couldn't shake the feeling that his greatest discoveries lay not in his research, but in what he had learned about himself. The forest seemed to watch in silence as he prepared to leave, its secrets still largely untold. And somewhere in the vast wilderness, a mother bear and her cubs continued their lives, blissfully unaware of the profound impact they had had on one man's journey of scientific discovery and self-realization. The morning sun had barely crested the mountain peaks when Dr. Henry Foster emerged from his tent, his face a mask of grim determination. Despite his decision to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that his work here was unfinished. He had come to Yellowstone to study grizzly bears, and he was determined to gather as much data as possible before departing. "One last expedition," he muttered to himself as he packed his day pack. "Just a few more observations, then I'm out of here." He double-checked his gear: bear spray, first aid kit, GPS, camera, and extra batteries. Everything was in order. With a deep breath, he set out into the wilderness, the weight of his recent encounters heavy on his mind. The forest was alive with the sounds of early morning. Birds chirped their greetings to the new day, small creatures rustled in the underbrush, and a gentle breeze whispered through the trees. Under different circumstances, Henry might have found it peaceful. Today, however, every sound set his nerves on edge. He hiked for several hours, carefully documenting signs of bear activity: overturned rocks, claw marks on trees, and scat. Each discovery sent a mixture of excitement and apprehension through him. As the day wore on, Henry found himself in a small clearing near a bubbling stream. The sound of running water masked other forest noises, making him increasingly uneasy. He scanned the area carefully before kneeling to refill his water bottle. That's when he heard it, a low rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath him. Henry's blood ran cold. Slowly he raised his head, his eyes widening as he took in the sight before him. Not 20 yards away stood a massive grizzly bear, its brown fur gleaming in the dappled sunlight. The bear's head was low, its small eyes fixed intently on Henry. Time seemed to stand still. Henry's mind raced, recalling every bit of bear safety training he'd ever received. "Don't run. Make yourself look big. Speak calmly but firmly." With trembling hands, he slowly rose to his full height, arms raised to appear larger. "Hey, bear," he called out, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I see you there. I'm just passing through. No need for trouble." The bear huffed, pawing at the ground. It seemed unsure, perhaps as startled by Henry's presence as he was by its... "That's right," Henry continued, taking a small step backward. "I'm not a threat, just going to back away nice and slow." For a tense moment, it seemed to be working. The bear stopped pawing the ground, its aggressive posture relaxing slightly. Henry dared to hope that this encounter might end peacefully, but fate had other plans. A sudden gust of wind swirled through the clearing, carrying Henry's scent directly to the bear. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The grizzly reared, up on its hind legs, towering over Henry at nearly 9 feet tall. It let out a deafening roar that Henry felt in his very bones. "Oh God," Henry breathed, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The bear dropped back to all fours and began to advance, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. Henry knew he had seconds to act before the situation became deadly. With shaking hands, he reached for his bear spray. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't want to use this." But the bear kept coming, picking up speed. In that moment, Henry made a decision that would change the course of his life. He stood his ground. With a silent prayer, He depressed the trigger on the bear spray, sending a cloud of capsaicin-laced mist directly into the charging bear's face. The effect was immediate. The grizzly reared back, roaring in pain and confusion. It shook its massive head violently, paws swiping at its burning eyes and nose. Henry didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Branches whipped at his face. Roots threatened to trip him at every step, but terror lent him speed and agility he didn't know he possessed. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled, the bear's pained roars fading behind him. Finally, gasping for breath, he slumped against a large tree, straining his ears for any sign of pursuit. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the reality of what had just happened washed over Henry. He had faced down a charging grizzly bear and lived to tell the tale. The encounter replayed in his mind, each moment etched in vivid detail. "I can't believe I did that," he muttered to himself, running a shaky hand through his sweat-soaked hair. "I actually stood my ground." As his breathing slowly returned to normal, Henry took stock of his situation. In his panicked flight, he had lost all sense of direction. His GPS device, thankfully still attached to his belt, would help him find his way back to camp. But first, he needed to ensure he was out of the bear's territory. With trembling hands, he pulled out his water bottle and took a long drink. The cool liquid helped to clear his head, and he forced himself to think rationally. The bear, disoriented and in pain from the spray, was unlikely to have followed him. Still, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Henry began to make his way carefully back in the general direction of his campsite, all thoughts of further research forgotten for the moment. As he hiked, he reflected on the events of the day. He had come to Yellowstone to study bear behavior, and he had certainly gotten an up-close look at it. But at what cost? The encounter had shaken him to his core. The raw power and speed of the grizzly, the primal fear he had felt. These were experiences that would stay with him forever. And yet, beneath the lingering fear, a small part of him thrilled at what had happened. He had faced one of nature's most fearsome predators and lived to tell the tale. As the familiar outlines of his campsite came into view, Henry let out a sigh of relief. He had made it back safely. But as he began to unpack his gear, his hands still shaking slightly, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point. That night, as he lay in his tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, Henry's mind raced. The day's events played on loop in his head. The sudden appearance of the bear, the heart-stopping moment of the charge, the split-second decision to stand his ground. Sleep eluded him, every rustle outside his tent sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. "What am I doing here?" he asked himself in the darkness. "Is this research really worth risking my life?" But as the first light of dawn began to filter through his tent, Henry made a surprising realization. Despite the terror he had experienced, despite the very real danger he had faced, he felt more alive than he had in years. The encounter had stripped away all pretense, leaving him face to face with the raw essence of life and death in the wild. With a newfound sense of purpose, Henry emerged from his tent to greet the new day. He had come to Yellowstone to study grizzly bears, and he had gained insights that went far beyond mere scientific observation. He had learned about courage, about survival, and about his own capacity to face fear head-on. As he began to prepare his breakfast, Henry made a decision. He would not leave Yellowstone, not yet. There was still much to learn, both about the bears and about himself. "I'm not finished here," he said aloud, his voice firm with resolve. "Not by a long shot." The forest seemed to whisper in response, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees, and somewhere in the vast wilderness, a grizzly bear continued its own journey, unaware of the profound impact it had had on one man's quest for knowledge and self-discovery. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Henry Foster set out once more into the wild, his fear tempered by a new respect for the wilderness and its inhabitants. He had come to Yellowstone as a scientist. He would leave as something more, a man forever changed by his encounters with one of nature's most magnificent and terrifying creatures. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Dr. Henry Foster emerged from his tent, his face a mixture of determination and apprehension. Despite the harrowing encounters of the past few days, he was resolved to continue his research. But today's expedition would be different. He planned to observe from a safer distance, using a powerful telephoto lens and a camouflaged blind he had constructed. As Henry packed his gear, he ran through his mental checklist. Camera, check. Extra batteries, check. Bear spray. He paused, holding the canister that had saved his life just yesterday. Definitely check. With everything secured, Henry set out into the wilderness. The forest was quiet in the early morning, light, mist still clinging to the ground in ghostly tendrils. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system, but he pressed on, determined to reach the observation point he had scouted earlier. After an hour of careful hiking, Henry arrived at his destination, a small rise overlooking a meadow known for bear activity. He quickly set up his blind, a small tent-like structure covered in camouflage netting, and settled in with his camera and notebook. Hours passed with little activity. Henry documented the smaller wildlife, squirrels, birds, and the occasional deer, but the bears remained elusive. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat inside the blind became stifling. "Come on," Henry muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Where are you?" Just as he was considering calling it a day, movement at the edge of the meadow caught his eye. Henry's breath caught in his throat as a massive grizzly bear ambled into view. It was a male, judging by its size, with fur the color of dark honey and a distinctive scar across its muzzle. Henry's camera clicked rapidly as he documented the bear's behavior. The grizzly seemed relaxed, pausing occasionally to dig for roots or investigate interesting scents. This was exactly the kind of natural behavior Henry had hoped to observe. "Fascinating," he whispered, jotting notes between photos. "The way it uses its claws to dig, the pattern of its foraging." So engrossed was he in his observations that Henry almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. Human footsteps. His blood ran cold as he realized someone was about to unknowingly walk into a potentially deadly situation. Moments later, a young couple emerged from the tree line, laughing and talking loudly. They were clearly tourists, carrying day packs and water bottles, completely oblivious to the danger mere yards away. The bear's head snapped up, its nostrils flaring as it caught their scent. It rose to its hind legs, towering at its full height, trying to get a better look at the intruders. Henry knew he had seconds to act. If he stayed hidden, the couple would walk straight into the bear. If he revealed himself, he risked startling the bear into an attack. It was an impossible choice, but one he had to make. "Hey!" he shouted, bursting out of his blind. "Stop right there." The couple froze, startled by his sudden appearance. The man instinctively stepped in front of the woman, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What's going on?" the man called back, his voice trembling slightly. Henry pointed urgently towards the bear, which was now dropping back to all fours, its posture tense and alert. "Grizzly bear, about 50 yards to your left. Don't run. Back away slowly." The woman let out a small gasp as she spotted the bear. "Oh my God, Tom," she whispered, clutching her partner's arm. "That's okay," Henry said, trying to project calm authority despite his racing heart. "Just move slowly. I'm going to come to you, all right?" Keeping his eyes on the bear, Henry began to edge towards the couple. The grizzly huffed, taking a few steps in their direction. Its eyes darted between Henry and the tourists, as if unsure which potential threat to focus on. "What do we do?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay calm," Henry replied, finally reaching them. "We're going to back away together. Nice and slow. Whatever you do, don't run." The trio began to retreat, step by agonizing step. The bear watched them intently, occasionally rising to its hind legs for a better view. Every time it did, Henry felt his heart skip a beat. They had made it about halfway to the tree line when disaster struck. The woman, her eyes fixed fearfully on the bear, stumbled over a hidden root. She cried out as she fell, the sudden noise and movement snapping the tension like a rubber band. The bear charged. Time seemed to slow down. Henry saw the powerful muscles rippling under the bear's shaggy coat, heard the heavy huffs of its breath, felt the ground shake under its thundering paws. In that eternal moment, a lifetime of training and preparation condensed into a single, crucial decision. "Get behind me," Henry shouted, pushing the couple back as he reached for his bear spray. As the grizzly closed the distance between them with terrifying speed, he depressed the trigger, sending a cloud of potent capsaicin spray directly into the oncoming bear's face. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The bear reared up with a roar of pain and confusion, massive paws swiping at its burning eyes and nose. It staggered backwards, shaking its head violently. "Run!" Henry yelled, grabbing the woman's arm and pulling her to her feet. "Back to the trees now." They ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Branches whipped at their faces and arms, roots threatened to trip them at every step, but terror lent them speed and agility they didn't know they possessed. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs trembled, the bear's pained roars fading behind them. Finally, gasping for breath, they collapsed against a large tree, straining their ears for any sign of pursuit. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the reality of what had just happened washed over them. They had faced down a charging grizzly bear and lived to tell the tale. "Is it gone?" the woman asked between ragged breaths. Henry nodded, still too winded to speak. He listened intently, but heard nothing but the usual forest sounds. The bear, disoriented and in pain from the spray, had likely retreated. "That was—" Tom started, shaking his head in disbelief. "You saved our lives, mister." "Thank you." Henry managed a weak smile. "Dr. Henry Foster," he introduced himself, "and you're welcome, but let's get back to the main trail before we celebrate, all right?" As they made their way carefully back towards more populated areas, Henry explained the basics of bear safety to the shaken couple. They listened intently, the reality of their close call sinking in with every word. It was late afternoon by the eye. Time they reached the ranger station. After giving their statements and receiving a thorough lecture on wilderness safety from the park rangers, the couple turned to Henry. "We can't thank you enough, Dr. Foster," the woman said, her eyes brimming with tears. "If you hadn't been there—" Henry nodded solemnly. "Just promise me you'll take the safety briefing seriously from now on. The wilderness is beautiful, but it can be deadly if you're not prepared." As he watched the couple drive away, Henry was struck by a profound realization. He had come to Yellowstone to study bears, to observe their behavior from a safe distance. Instead, he had been thrust into the heart of a life-or-death encounter, forced to use all of his knowledge and training to save not just himself, but others as well. That night, as he lay in his tent back at his campsite, Henry reflected on the day's events. The terror of the bear charge, the quick thinking that had saved 3 lives, the gratitude of the couple he had rescued, it all swirled in his mind, refusing to let him rest. But beneath the lingering fear and adrenaline, a new feeling was taking root, a sense of purpose, of responsibility. He had the knowledge and experience to help people understand these magnificent, dangerous creatures, to help them coexist safely with the wild. As the first light of dawn began to filter through his tent, Henry made a decision. He would complete his research, yes, but he would also reach out to the Park Service. Perhaps he could develop educational programs, lead workshops on bear safety for visitors. "Time to make a difference," he murmured to himself as he emerged from his tent to greet the new day. The forest seemed to whisper in response, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. And somewhere in the vast wilderness, the grizzly bears continued their ancient routines, majestic and wild, a living reminder of the untamed heart of nature. The night air was crisp and cold as Dr. Henry Foster sat huddled in his makeshift shelter, a hastily constructed lean-to of branches and leaves. His breath came out in visible puffs, and he pulled his tattered jacket tighter around his shivering frame. The events of the past few hours played on repeat in his mind, a nightmarish loop he couldn't escape. It had started as a routine day of observation. Henry had ventured further into the backcountry of Yellowstone, following reports of increased bear activity in the area. He had been cautious, vigilant, but sometimes even the best precautions weren't enough. The grizzly had appeared without warning, erupting from the undergrowth with a speed that defied its massive size. Henry had reacted on instinct, deploying his bear spray, but in his haste the canister had slipped from his grasp, falling uselessly to the forest floor. What followed was a blur of terror and pain. The bear's massive paw had connected with his chest, sending him flying. He remembered tumbling down a slope, the world spinning around him, before everything went black. Now, as the long night stretched before him, Henry took stock of his situation. His ribs ached with every breath, and a deep gash on his leg throbbed relentlessly. His backpack was gone, lost in the chaotic flight from the bear. With it went most of his supplies, his satellite phone, and any real hope of a quick rescue. "You really did it this time, Foster," he muttered to himself, wincing as he shifted position. "Guess all that bear safety training didn't cover what to do when you're actually mauled." A twig snapped in the darkness beyond his shelter, and Henry froze. His eyes strained against the gloom, heart pounding as he listened for any sign of the bear's return. After several agonizing moments, he heard the soft padding of paws moving away. The grizzly was still out there, perhaps having lost interest in its injured prey, but for how long? As the adrenaline subsided, exhaustion began to set in. Henry fought against the heaviness of his eyelids, knowing that sleep could be deadly in his exposed position. He needed to stay alert, to listen for any approach of the bear, to be ready to what? In his current state, he stood no chance against a determined grizzly. To keep himself awake, Henry began to talk aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, Foster, think. What's the protocol here? Stay put and wait for rescue? Try to make it back to a trail?" He shook his head, immediately regretting the motion as pain lanced through his neck. "No, moving's not an option right now. Just got to hang on until morning. Someone will notice you're missing. They'll send out a search party." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. He had told the park rangers he might be out for several days. Would they really start looking for him so soon? As the night wore on, Henry drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he jerked awake, panic surging through him as he remembered his predicament. The forest around him was alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, and always the possibility of larger, more dangerous movement. In his more lucid moments, Henry found his thoughts turning to the bears he had come to study. He had always seen them as subjects, fascinating creatures to be observed and understood. Now he had experienced firsthand their raw power and ferocity. It was a humbling realization. "We forget sometimes," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "We think we're at the top of the food chain, but out here, we're just another animal trying to survive." As dawn began to break, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Henry made a grim assessment of his situation. His leg had stopped bleeding, but the pain was intense. Moving would be difficult, if not impossible. Dehydration was setting in, his mouth dry and tongue feeling swollen. And always there was the threat of the bear's return. Got to try something, he decided. With agonizing slowness, he began to gather what materials he could reach. Leaves, sticks, anything that might burn. If he could start a fire, the smoke might attract attention. It was a risk. The fire could also attract predators, but at this point he was running out of options. Hours passed as Henry struggled with his makeshift fire starter. His hands shook from cold and fatigue, and more than once he had to stop, gasping in pain as his injuries protested the movement. Finally, a small spark caught, and a tendril of smoke rose from the pile of tinder. Come on," Henry urged, carefully feeding the tiny flame. Gradually it grew, consuming the dry leaves and twigs. Soon a small but steady fire burned before him. Henry added green leaves, producing more smoke. He watched it rise above the treetops, hoping against hope that someone would see it. As the day wore on, Henry drifted in and out of consciousness. The fire burned low, and he lacked the strength to gather more fuel. His thoughts became muddled, reality blending with feverish dreams. He saw the grizzly again, but this time it spoke to him in a deep, rumbling voice. "Why are you here, human?" the bear seemed to ask. "This is not your world." I wanted to understand," Henry mumbled, unsure if he was speaking aloud or just in his mind. "To learn about you, to help protect you, to help." The bear's eyes, small and dark, bored into him. "And now, what have you learned?" Henry pondered this through the haze of pain and dehydration. "That I'm the intruder here," he finally answered. "That all my research, all my precautions, they don't make me any less vulnerable, any less human." The bear nodded, its massive head dipping once. "Remember this when you return to your world of concrete and machines. Remember what it is to be part of nature, not separate from it." A sudden noise jolted Henry back to full consciousness. He blinked, disoriented. the bear from his vision fading away. The noise came again, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder. By the second, it took his addled brain a moment to recognize it. Helicopter blades. "Here!" He tried to shout, but his parched throat produced only a weak croak. Summoning what little strength he had left, Henry grabbed a branch and waved it above his head, trying to attract attention. The helicopter appeared over the treetops, its downwash sending leaves and debris swirling around the small clearing. Henry saw figures in bright orange rappelling down, and then everything became a blur of activity. Hands were checking his vitals. Voices were asking him questions he couldn't quite follow. As they loaded him into a rescue basket, Henry caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. There, partially hidden by the undergrowth, stood a massive grizzly bear. For a moment their eyes met, and Henry felt a jolt of recognition. Was it the same bear that had attacked him? The one from his fever dream? Before he could process it, the bear turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the forest. "Did you see that?" Henry asked weakly, as they secured him in the helicopter. "The bear!" The rescue medic leaned in close to hear him over the roar of the rotors. "Just rest easy, Dr. Foster. You're safe now. We're taking you to the hospital." As the helicopter lifted off, Henry took one last look at the wilderness below. The vastness of it struck him anew. The endless trees, the rugged mountains, the wild rivers. And somewhere down there, the bears continued their ancient routines, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. Henry closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking him. But even as he drifted off, he knew that this experience had changed him profoundly. He had come to Yellowstone as a scientist, seeking to understand the grizzlies from a safe distance. He was leaving as a survivor, with a newfound respect for the raw power of nature and his own place within it. The lessons learned in those harrowing hours would stay with him forever, shaping not just his research, but his entire worldview. As the helicopter sped towards civilization and medical care, Dr. Henry Foster knew that his journey, both physical and philosophical, was far from over. The steady beep of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Dr. Henry Foster slowly regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus in the harsh fluorescent light. As awareness returned, so did the pain, a dull ache that seemed to permeate every inch of his body. "Welcome back, Dr. Foster," a gentle voice said from his bedside. A nurse in crisp blue scrubs was checking his vitals, her face lined with concern and relief. "You gave us quite a scare." Henry tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. The nurse quickly offered him a cup of water with a straw. After a few sips, he managed to croak out, "How long?" "You've been here for 3 days," the nurse replied. "You were in and out of consciousness when they brought you in. Do you remember what happened?" The memories came rushing back in a flood of terror and adrenaline. The bear, the attack, the long night alone in the wilderness. Henry nodded slowly, wincing at the movement. "The bear," he whispered. "How bad is it?" Before the nurse could answer, the door opened, and a doctor entered, followed closely by 2 park rangers. The doctor, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper, hair, approached the bed with a reassuring smile. "Dr. Foster, I'm Dr. Patel. It's good to see you awake. You're a very lucky man," he said, picking up Henry's chart. "You've got 4 broken ribs, a deep laceration on your left leg that required quite a few stitches, and a mild concussion. But considering what you went through, it could have been much worse." Henry listened in a daze as Dr. Patel outlined his injuries and recovery plan. The words washed over him, but his mind was still back in the forest, reliving the terrifying moments of the attack. Once Dr. Patel had finished his explanation and left to check on other patients, the 2 park rangers stepped forward. Henry recognized one of them, Ranger Thompson, who had given him his initial briefing when he arrived at Yellowstone. "Dr. Foster," Thompson said, his voice grave, "we need to talk about what happened out there." Over the next hour, Henry recounted his ordeal in painstaking detail. The rangers listened intently, occasionally interrupting with questions about the bear's behavior or the exact location of the attack. "From what you've described," Ranger Thompson said when Henry had finished, "it sounds like you inadvertently got between a mother and her cubs. That's the most dangerous situation you can find yourself in with grizzlies." Henry nodded, remembering the terror he'd felt when he realized his mistake. "I thought I was being careful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've studied bears for years, but out there, it all happened so fast." The other ranger, a younger woman Henry didn't recognize, leaned forward. "Dr. Foster, we've had reports of an unusually aggressive female grizzly in that area. Your encounter matches the pattern we've been seeing. We may need to take action." Henry's heart sank. He knew what taking action could mean in cases of problem bears. "What kind of action?" he asked, dreading the answer. Ranger Thompson sighed heavily. "If we can't relocate her successfully, we may have no choice but to euthanize her. It's not a decision we make lightly, but human safety has to come first." "No," Henry said more forcefully than he intended, causing pain to flare in his ribs. He took a breath, trying to calm himself. "Please, you can't do that. She was just protecting her cubs. It was my fault for getting too close." The rangers exchanged a look. "We understand your position, Dr. Foster," the female ranger said gently. "But this bear has been involved in multiple incidents. We can't risk human lives." Henry felt a surge of guilt and responsibility. His research was supposed to help protect these animals, not lead to their destruction. "Give me a chance to help," he pleaded. "Once I'm recovered, I can assist with relocation efforts. I know these bears, their behaviors. There must be a way to avoid killing her." Ranger Thompson considered this for a moment. "Your expertise could be valuable," he admitted, "but you've just been through a traumatic experience. Are you sure you want to get involved?" Henry nodded emphatically, ignoring the pain the movement caused. "More than ever. This experience, it's changed my perspective. I need to do this, not just for the bear, but for myself." The rangers agreed to consider his offer, promising to be in touch once he was released from the hospital. As they left, Henry sank back into his pillows, exhausted but determined. Over the next few weeks, as Henry's body slowly healed, his resolve only grew stronger. He spent hours poring over maps of the park, studying recent bear sightings and formulating plans for safe relocation. The doctors and nurses were amazed at his focus and determination, especially given the trauma he had endured. Dr. Patel, during one of his checkups, couldn't hide his curiosity. "I must say, Dr. Foster, your attitude is remarkable. Many people in your situation would never want to see a bear again, let alone help one." Henry managed a small smile. "I've dedicated my life to studying these animals, Doctor. What happened to me, it was terrifying, yes, but it was also a stark reminder of why my work is so important. We need to find ways to coexist with these creatures, not eliminate them when conflicts arise." As his discharge date approached, Henry received a visit from Ranger Thompson. The older man looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than Henry remembered. "We've had another incident," Thompson said without preamble. "A hiker was injured yesterday. Not as seriously as you, but it's forced our hand. We're mobilizing a team to track and tranquilize the bear tomorrow." Henry felt his heart race, and if you can't relocate her safely, Thompson's silence was answer enough. "Let me come with you," Henry said, sitting up straighter in his hospital bed. "I'm being discharged tomorrow. I may not be up for hiking, but I can advise your team. Help ensure this is done as safely as possible, for both the bear and your people." Ranger Thompson looked skeptical. "Dr. Foster, you're still recovering. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than going in without someone who intimately understands bear behavior," Henry countered. "I know I'm not fully healed, but I can contribute from a base camp. Please, Ranger Thompson, let me help make this right." After a long moment, Thompson nodded. "All right, but you follow every safety protocol to the letter. I'm not having another injured scientist on my conscience." The next morning, against his doctor's adamant advice, Henry checked out of the hospital and joined the park service team. As they drove into the backcountry, he felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The forest that had nearly claimed his life now held the key to his redemption and the survival of the very creature that had attacked him. As they set up the base camp, Henry couldn't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see a hulking grizzly emerge at any moment, but the forest remained quiet, holding its secrets close. "Remember," he told the team as they prepared to head out, "this bear isn't evil or malicious. She's a mother protecting her cubs in the only way she knows how. Our job is to ensure the safety of park visitors while also preserving the natural behaviors of these magnificent animals. As the team disappeared into the woods, Henry settled in at the command center, ready to provide guidance and expertise. He knew the next few hours would be crucial, not just for the bear and her cubs, but for his own journey of recovery and understanding. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this delicate dance between man and nature would play out. And somewhere in its depths, a mother grizzly and her cubs went about their day, unaware that their fate hung in the balance, and that their greatest advocate was the very man who had once been their victim. The sun had barely crested the mountains when the tranquilizer dart found its mark. The mother grizzly let out a startled roar, more of confusion than pain before the powerful sedative began to take effect. Her massive form swayed for a moment, then collapsed with a thud that seemed to shake the forest floor. Back at the base camp, Dr. Henry Foster leaned forward in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his still-healing ribs. "Status report," he barked into the radio, his knuckles white as he gripped the device. "Target is down," came the crackled response. "No casualties." "Cubs are nearby but unharmed." Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Good work, team. Approach with caution and prepare for transport. Remember, even sedated, she's incredibly dangerous." As the team moved in to secure the bear, Henry turned to Ranger Thompson, who had been observing silently. "We did it," Henry said, a mix of relief and excitement in his voice. "Now comes the hard part." Thompson nodded gravely. "Relocation is never a guarantee, Dr. Foster. You know as well as I do that many bears find their way back to their original territory." "I know," Henry replied, his face set with determination, "but we have to try. It's our responsibility to find a way to coexist with these animals, not just eliminate them when conflicts arise." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. The sedated bear was carefully loaded onto a specially designed transport vehicle, while wildlife biologists worked to capture and secure the cubs. Henry oversaw every step of the process, his expertise proving invaluable despite his still recovering state. As they prepared to move out, Henry approached the transport vehicle. Through the reinforced grate, he could see the bear's massive form, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. This close, he could make out the scars on her muzzle, testament to a life lived wild and free. "You remember me, don't you?" Henry murmured, more to himself than the unconscious bear. "I certainly remember you." The memory of their violent encounter flashed through his mind, the terror, the pain, the long night alone in the wilderness. But looking at her now, Henry felt no fear or anger. Instead, he was filled with a profound sense of respect and responsibility. "We're going to give you a new start," he told the sleeping giant. "Somewhere you and your cubs can thrive, away from humans. It's the least we can do." The convoy set out as the sun reached its zenith, winding its way through the park towards a remote area of the Absaroka Range. Henry rode in the lead vehicle with Ranger Thompson, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror to check on the transport behind them. "You know," Thompson said after a long stretch of silence, "when you first came to the park, I thought you were just another academic who didn't understand the realities of wildlife management. I'm glad to say I was wrong." Henry managed a small smile. "I've learned more in the past few weeks than I did in years of research. Sometimes you have to be reminded of the wild in wildlife." As they neared the release site, a tense anticipation filled the air. The team worked quickly and efficiently to prepare, knowing that timing was crucial. The sedative would be wearing off soon, and they needed to be clear of the area before the bear fully regained consciousness. Finally, everything was in place. The transport cage was opened, and the team retreated to a safe distance. Henry insisted on staying to observe, despite the protests of the medical staff who had accompanied them. "I need to see this through," he told them firmly. "I'll stay back, I promise." Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Then finally movement. The bear's massive head lifted, shaking off the last effects of the sedative. She lumbered to her feet, swaying slightly as she took in her new surroundings. Henry held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. This was the critical moment. Would she panic, charge, or would she accept her new territory? The grizzly took a few tentative steps, her nose working overtime as she processed the unfamiliar scents. Then, to Henry's immense relief, she turned and ambled into the dense forest, quickly disappearing from view. A cheer went up from the team, but Henry remained silent, his eyes fixed on the spot where the bear had vanished. It wasn't until the cubs were released and had scampered after their mother that he finally allowed himself to relax. "It's done," Ranger Thompson said, clapping a hand on Henry's shoulder. "You should be proud, Dr. Foster. This is a win for everyone, the bear, the park, and the visitors who'll be safer because of it." Henry nodded, but his expression remained solemn. "It's a start," he said. "But there's still so much work to do. This can't be a one-off success. We need to develop long-term strategies for human-wildlife coexistence." As the team packed up their gear and prepared for the long drive back, Henry found himself drawn to the edge of the clearing. The forest stretched out before him, wild and untamed. Somewhere in its depths a family of bears was finding its way in a new home. "Good luck," he whispered to the wilderness. "Stay wild, stay free, but please, stay away from humans." The drive back to park headquarters was quieter, the adrenaline of the day giving way to exhaustion. Henry's body ached, reminding him that he was still far from fully healed. But his mind was clearer than it had been since the attack. As they pulled into the ranger station, Henry turned to Thompson. "I want to propose a new initiative," he said. "A comprehensive program to reduce human-bear conflicts in the park. Education, infrastructure improvements, maybe even some limited closures in high-risk areas during peak bear activity times." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious, Dr. Foster. It'll take a lot of work and you'll face resistance from some quarters." "I know," Henry replied, his jaw set with determination. "But after everything that's happened, I can't just go back to my lab and write papers. We need to take action, to find a way for humans and bears to share this land safely." The ranger studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he said. "Draft up a proposal. I'll make sure it gets in front of the right people." As Henry stepped out of the vehicle, he was hit by a wave of fatigue. The events of the past weeks, the attack, his recovery, and today's relocation effort seemed to crash over him all at once. But beneath the exhaustion was a spark of excitement, of purpose. He had come to Yellowstone to study bears, to observe them from a safe distance. Instead, he had been thrust into the heart of the complex and often contentious relationship between humans and wildlife. The experience had changed him profoundly, giving him a new perspective on his work and his place in the natural world. That night, as Henry lay in his bed at the park's researcher accommodations, he found his thoughts drifting to the mother bear and her cubs. Were they settling into their new home? Would they stay away from human-populated areas, or would the pull of their old territory prove too strong? He knew there were no guarantees in wildlife management. The relocated bears might thrive in their new home, or they might become another statistic in the ongoing challenge of human-wildlife conflict. But for the first time since the attack, Henry felt truly hopeful. As he drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled not with the terror of that fateful day, but with visions of a future where humans and bears could coexist in harmony. It was a lofty goal, perhaps even an impossible one, but Henry Foster was determined to spend the rest of his career working towards it, one small step at a time. In the vast wilderness of Yellowstone, under a sky blazing with stars, life went on. Bears foraged and fished, wolves howled in the distance, and the great wheel of nature continued to turn. And in a small cabin on the edge of it all, a scientist slept, his body still bearing the scars of his encounter with the wild, but his spirit renewed and ready for the challenges ahead. The serene beauty of Yellowstone National Park masked a growing tension as reports of aggressive bear behavior began to mount. Over the course of a single summer, 4 separate encounters with a particularly bold grizzly bear left the park rangers and wildlife officials grappling with a difficult decision. Dr. Henry Foster, bear behaviorist and lead researcher on the Yellowstone Grizzly Project, found himself at the center of the unfolding drama. As he pored over incident reports and eyewitness accounts, a pattern began to emerge, one that both fascinated and alarmed him. The first encounter occurred on a crisp June morning. Sarah Linden, an experienced hiker, had ventured off the main trail in search of a rare wildflower when she stumbled upon a gruesome scene. The partially consumed carcass of an elk lay in a small clearing surrounded by massive paw prints. "I've been hiking these trails for years," Sarah later recounted, her voice still shaky from the experience. "But I've never seen anything like this. The sheer size of those prints. I knew I had to get out of there fast." Sarah's hasty retreat likely saved her life. As she scrambled back towards the main trail, she heard a low, menacing growl behind her. She didn't stop to look back. The second encounter came just 2 weeks later. Ranger Tom Thompson was conducting a routine patrol when he spotted the grizzly near a popular campground. The bear showed no fear of humans, standing its ground even as Thompson attempted to scare it off. "In all my years as a ranger, I've never seen a bear so bold," Thompson reported. "It was like it was sizing me up, deciding if I was worth the trouble. That's not normal behavior, and it's deeply concerning." Thompson's warning led to increased patrols and temporary closures of several campsites, but the bear seemed undeterred by the heightened human presence. The third encounter proved to be the most tragic. Wildlife photographer Mark Chan had ventured deep into the backcountry, hoping to capture images of bears in their natural habitat. His last photograph, recovered from his damaged camera, showed a massive grizzly charging directly at the lens. Chen's body was found 3 days later, after he failed to return from his expedition. The attack sent shockwaves through the park community and raised serious questions about the management of Yellowstone's bear population. "Mark knew the risks," his wife said through tears at a press conference. "He always said that, to truly capture the essence of these animals you had to get close, but he never thought." The final encounter of that fateful summer brought the issue to a head. Dr. Foster himself, while conducting field research, came face to face with the grizzly. Unlike the others, he survived to tell the tale, but not without serious injuries. "Saw her cubs first," Foster recalled from his hospital bed, his voice weak but his eyes bright with the memory. "They were playing by a stream, so innocent and carefree. Then I heard the mother's roar. I knew I had made a terrible mistake." Foster's encounter lasted only moments, but the impact would be felt for months to come. As he recovered from his injuries, he became a vocal advocate for a new approach to bear management in the park. "We can't simply remove or euthanize bears that come into conflict with humans," he argued in a passionate presentation to the park board. "These animals are a vital part of the Yellowstone ecosystem. We need to find a way to coexist." As summer turned to fall, the tension in Yellowstone reached a breaking point. Visitors were on edge, rangers were overwhelmed, and the wildlife management team was divided on how to proceed. The grizzly at the center of the incidents had become something of a legend, dubbed the Ghost by local media for its ability to appear and disappear seemingly at will. Dr. Foster's team worked tirelessly to develop a comprehensive plan for reducing human-bear conflicts. They proposed a combination of enhanced visitor education, strategic trail closures during peak bear activity times, and the use of new technologies to track and predict bear movements. "We're not just trying to protect humans," Foster explained to a skeptical group of local residents. "We're trying to protect the bears too. Every time there's a conflict, it puts pressure on wildlife officials to take drastic action. If we can prevent these encounters from happening in the first place, it's better for everyone." Not everyone was convinced. Some called for more aggressive measures, arguing that human safety should be the top priority. Others worried that increased restrictions would hurt the local tourism industry, which relied heavily on Yellowstone's reputation as a place to see wildlife up close. As the debate raged on, the Ghost continued to make its presence felt. Trail. Cameras captured glimpses of the massive bear, its distinctive scar visible even in grainy nighttime footage. Hikers reported finding fresh tracks and scat in areas that had been deemed safe. The grizzly seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, a constant reminder of the wild and unpredictable nature of the park. Dr. Foster, now fully recovered from his injuries, spent long hours in the field attempting to understand the Ghost's behavior. He tracked its movements, analyzed its feeding patterns, and studied the complex dynamics of the bear's family group. "There's something unique about this bear," he noted in his field journal. "It's not just its size or its boldness. There's an intelligence there, adaptability that's both impressive and concerning. It's like it's learned to navigate the human world in a way most bears never do. As winter approached and the park prepared for its seasonal slowdown, a sense of unresolved tension lingered in the air. The ghost had retreated into the deep backcountry, but everyone knew it would return with the spring thaw. The incidents of the past summer had left an indelible mark on Yellowstone, forcing both park officials and visitors to reconsider their relationship with the wild. In his final report of the season, Dr. Foster wrote, "The challenges we face in Yellowstone are a microcosm of the larger issues surrounding wildlife conservation in an increasingly human-dominated world. How do we preserve the wildness of these animals while also ensuring human safety? There are no easy answers, but we must continue to search for solutions. The future of Yellowstone and of wilderness areas around the world depends on our ability to find a balance." As the first snow began to fall, blanketing the park in a quiet hush, the story of the ghost and the summer of encounters faded into park legend. But for those who had lived through it, the hikers, the rangers, the researchers, and the survivors, the experience had forever changed their perception of the delicate balance between humans and nature. Sarah Linden, the hiker who had made the initial discovery, summed it up best in a letter to the Park Service. "I used to think of Yellowstone as a playground, a place for adventure. Now I see it for what it truly is, a wild and beautiful realm where we are merely guests. We must never forget that we enter these lands at nature's mercy, not the other way around." The Yellowstone grizzly incidents served as a stark reminder of the power and unpredictability of nature, and the ongoing challenge of preserving wild spaces in a changing world. As Yellowstone prepared for a new season, the lessons learned from that tense summer would continue to shape the park's approach to wildlife management for years to come. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. Emily Robinson stepped off the small bush plane onto the gravel airstrip, her heart racing with excitement. The crisp Alaskan air filled her lungs as she took in the breathtaking vista of Denali National Park spread out before her. Towering mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist, loomed in the distance while dense forests of spruce and birch stretched as far as the eye could see. "Welcome to Denali," the pilot called out as he unloaded her gear. "You picked a great time to visit. The wildlife's been particularly active lately." Emily grinned, hefting her camera bag. "That's exactly what I'm hoping for. Thanks for the smooth flight, Jack." As Jack's plane took off, leaving her alone in the wilderness, Emily felt a mix of exhilaration and trepidation. This solo photography expedition was a dream come true, but the wild beauty of Alaska demanded respect. She shouldered her backpack and began the hike to her designated campsite. The trail wound through dense forest, the ground soft beneath her boots. Emily's senses were on high alert, drinking in every sight and sound. A red fox darted across her path, pausing to regard her with curious eyes before disappearing into the underbrush. "Oh, you beauty," Emily whispered, cursing herself for not having her camera at the ready. She vowed not to make that mistake again. After an hour of hiking, Emily reached her campsite. It was a small clearing nestled against a backdrop of towering pines with a bubbling creek nearby. Perfect for attracting wildlife, she thought. As she set up her tent, a twig snapped in the forest. Emily froze, her heart pounding. She scanned the tree line, camera in hand, but saw nothing. "Just your imagination," she told herself, but a prickle of unease lingered. With her camp established, Emily set out to explore the surrounding area. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. She moved slowly, careful not to disturb the natural rhythm of the wilderness. A flash of movement caught her eye. Emily raised her camera, focusing on a massive bull moose wading in a nearby pond. She held her breath, framing the shot perfectly. The click of her shutter was barely audible, but the moose's ears twitched. It raised its majestic head, antlers dripping with water, and stared directly at her. Emily's finger hovered over the shutter button, but she hesitated. The moment felt too intimate, too wild to capture. Slowly she lowered her camera, meeting the moose's gaze. For a heartbeat they regarded each other, human and beast, separated by eons of evolution, yet connected in this fleeting instant. The spell was broken by a loud splash as the moose turned and lumbered back into the forest. Emily released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands shook slightly as she reviewed the few shots she'd taken. "Incredible," she murmured, marveling at the raw power captured in her images. As the day wore on, Emily continued to explore, photographing the landscape and smaller wildlife, squirrels, marmots, and a variety of birds. But the encounter with the moose had awakened something in her, a hunger for more meaningful interactions with the denizens of this wild place. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Emily made her way back to her campsite, her mind racing with plans for the next day. She'd heard rumors of a black bear sighting in the area, and the thought of capturing images of such a magnificent creature filled her with anticipation. After a simple dinner of dehydrated camping food, Emily sat by her small fire, reviewing the day's photographs on her camera's display. The soft crackle of the flames and the gentle burbling of the nearby creek lulled her into a sense of peace. A rustling in the nearby bushes snapped her out of her reverie. Emily's hand instinctively went to the bear spray canister at her hip, a precaution she'd been advised to take, though she doubted she'd need it. She'd always considered bears to be majestic creatures, more afraid of humans than humans should be of them. The rustling grew louder, and Emily's breath caught in her throat as a black bear emerged from the underbrush. It was smaller than she'd expected, its fur glossy in the fading light. The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, its nose twitching as it caught her scent. Emily's photographer's instinct warred with her common sense. She knew she should make noise, try to scare the bear away, but the opportunity was too perfect. Slowly, carefully, she raised her camera. The bear's eyes locked onto her, curiosity evident in its gaze. It took a tentative step forward, then another. Emily's heart raced, but she forced her hands to remain steady as she captured shot after shot. "Hey there, big guy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're a handsome one, aren't you?" The bear tilted its head as if considering her words. Then it sat back on its haunches, looking for all the world like an overgrown dog. Emily couldn't believe her luck. This was the kind of encounter wildlife photographers dreamed of. As the light faded, Emily reluctantly lowered her camera. The bear remained at the edge of the clearing, seemingly content to watch her. She knew she should try to scare it off, but she couldn't bring herself to break the magical moment. "I've got to turn in for the night," she said softly, slowly standing up. "But feel free to stick around. Maybe we can do this again tomorrow." The bear blinked lazily, then lumbered back into the forest. Emily let out a shaky laugh, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She quickly stored her food in the bear-proof container provided by the Park Service, then retreated to her tent. As she lay in her sleeping bag, Emily replayed the encounter in her mind. The bear had seemed so docile, so unthreatening. She'd always heard that black bears were generally shy around humans, and this encounter seemed to confirm that belief. Sleep came fitfully that night. Emily's dreams were filled with images of wildlife, moose, foxes, and bears moving through mist-shrouded forests. In her dreams, she walked among them, her camera forgotten as she immersed herself in their world. A sound jolted her awake in the pre-dawn darkness. Emily lay still, listening intently. There it was again, a soft snuffling sound just outside her tent. Her heart began to race as she realized what it must be. The bear had returned. Emily's mind raced. Should she make noise to scare it away? Should she stay quiet and hope it lost interest? The park ranger's warnings about keeping a safe distance from wildlife echoed in her head, but the photographer in her longed for another close encounter. As the first rays of dawn began to lighten the sky, Emily made a decision. Slowly, carefully, she unzipped her tent, camera in hand. The bear was there just a few yards away, rooting through the underbrush at the edge of the campsite. In the growing light, Emily could see that it was the same bear from the night before. It looked up as she emerged from the tent, meeting her, gaze with that same curious expression. "Good morning," Emily whispered, raising her camera. "Fancy meeting you here." The bear huffed softly, then went back to its foraging. Emily's finger pressed the shutter button, capturing image after image of the bear in the ethereal dawn light. She knew she was taking a risk, knew she should be maintaining a safer distance, but the allure of the perfect shot was too strong to resist. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the clearing, Emily felt a sense of connection with the wild creature before her. This, she thought, this is why I came here. This is what I've been searching for. Little did she know that this magical morning was only the beginning. The true test of her respect for the wilderness and her own survival instincts was yet to come. The next morning, Emily woke with the sun, her body humming with anticipation. The encounter with the black bear the previous evening had left her eager for more. She quickly packed her camera gear and set out, hoping to catch the animal in the golden light of dawn. As she moved through the forest, Emily's senses were on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made her pause, camera at the ready. But the woods seemed unusually quiet this morning, as if holding their breath. After an hour of fruitless searching, Emily was about to head back to camp when she heard it, a low huffing sound that made her heart race. Slowly she turned, and there it was, the black bear, not 20 yards away, rooting through a fallen log. Emily's hands trembled as she raised her camera. The bear was larger than she, remembered, its black fur gleaming in the dappled sunlight. She zoomed in, capturing the texture of its coat, the intelligent gleam in its eyes. "Hey there, beautiful," she whispered, unable to contain her excitement. "Remember me?" At the sound of her voice, the bear's head snapped up. It regarded her, with what Emily could have sworn was recognition. Emboldened by their peaceful encounter the night before, she took a step closer. The bear didn't move, its dark eyes fixed on her. Emily's finger hovered over the shutter button, torn between capturing the moment and simply experiencing it. She opted for both, snapping a quick succession of shots before lowering the camera. "You're not so scary, are you?" Emily murmured, inching forward again. "Just a big softy looking for breakfast." As if in response, the bear huffed and shook its head. Emily laughed softly, marveling at how comfortable she felt in its presence. All her life, she'd dreamed of moments like this, genuine connections with wild animals in their natural habitat. But as Emily took another step, something changed. The bear's posture shifted, its muscles tensing beneath its thick fur. A low growl rumbled from its throat, stopping Emily in her tracks. "Whoa, easy there," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The bear rose to its full height, towering over Emily. In that moment, the reality of her situation came crashing down. This wasn't a docile creature posing for her camera. This was a wild animal, unpredictable and potentially deadly. Emily's hand went to the bear spray on her belt, but she hesitated. The bear hadn't charged, hadn't shown any real aggression beyond the warning growl. Maybe if she just backed away slowly. She took a careful step backward, then another. The bear watched her intently, still standing on its hind legs. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "That's right," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm leaving, no need for trouble." Suddenly the bear dropped to all fours and charged. Emily's world narrowed to a tunnel of terror as she saw 300 pounds of muscle and fur barreling towards her. Her fingers fumbled with the bear spray, finally wrenching it free. "No!" she screamed, depressing the nozzle. A cloud of capsaicin erupted between her and the charging bear. For a heart-stopping moment, Emily thought it wouldn't be enough. But, at the last second, the bear veered off, snorting and pawing at its face. Emily didn't wait to see what it would do next. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, blind with panic. Branches whipped at her face as she fled, her lungs burning. She could hear the bear crashing through the forest behind her, but she didn't dare look back. All she could think was run, run, run. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Emily burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. Her legs gave out and she collapsed, gasping for air. She rolled onto her back, expecting at any moment to feel the bear's claws tearing into her. But there was nothing. No sound of pursuit, no huffing breath of an enraged predator. Just the quiet. Sounds of the forest and Emily's own ragged breathing. Slowly, carefully, she sat up. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her water bottle as she took a long drink. As the adrenaline began to fade, Emily became aware of a stinging sensation on her cheek. She touched it gingerly, her fingers coming away smeared, with blood from where a branch had caught her. "Oh God," she whispered, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. "Oh God! Oh God!" Emily hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly as she tried to calm her racing heart. She'd been so stupid, so reckless. All the warnings she'd received, all the safety briefings she'd sat through, she'd ignored them all for the sake of a photograph. As her panic subsided, Emily realized she had no idea where she was. In her blind flight from the bear, she'd lost all sense of direction. Her GPS was back at the campsite along with most of her supplies. All she had was her camera, the clothes on her back, and the half-empty can of bear spray. "Okay, Emily," she said aloud, needing to hear a human voice, even if it was her own. "You can do this. Just pick a direction and start walking. You'll find your way back." She stood on shaky legs, wincing at the various scrapes and bruises she'd accumulated during her panicked flight. The sun was higher now, offering little help in determining direction. After a moment's hesitation, Emily picked what she hoped was the way back to her campsite and started walking. As she moved through the forest, Emily kept her camera clutched to her chest like a talimat. Despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to be angry at the bear. It had only been acting on instinct, defending its territory from a perceived threat. The fault lay entirely with her and her reckless disregard for safety. Hours passed, and Emily's initial confidence in finding her way back began to waver. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, each tree indistinguishable from the last. Her throat was parched, her stomach growling with hunger. Just as despair was beginning to set in, Emily heard a sound that made her heart leap. Voices, human voices carried on the wind from somewhere nearby. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. "Is someone there? I need help." For a moment there was silence. Then, blessedly, an answer. "Hello? Where are you?" Emily nearly wept with relief. "I'm here," she shouted. "I'm lost. Please help me." She moved towards the voice, pushing through a dense thicket. As she emerged on the other side, she found herself face to face with two startled hikers, a middle-aged couple with matching looks of concern. "Oh, thank God," Emily said, her legs giving out as the last of her adrenaline faded. The woman rushed forward to catch her. "Are you all right? What happened?" Emily looked up at them, suddenly aware of how she must appear, clothes torn, face scratched, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. I had an encounter with a bear," she said, the words sounding absurd even as she spoke them. "It charged me. I got lost running away." The man's eyebrows shot up. "A bear? Where? How long ago?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know. Hours ago, I think. I've been wandering ever since." The couple exchanged a look. "We need to report this," the man said. "There's a ranger station not far from here. Can you walk?" Emily nodded, accepting the woman's help to stand. As they made their way through the forest, she recounted her experience in halting sentences. With each word, the magnitude of her mistake became clearer. By the time they reached the ranger station, Emily was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. As a park ranger took her statement and checked her for injuries, the reality of the situation truly hit her. She'd come face to face with one of nature's most powerful predators and survived, but at what cost? Her recklessness could have easily resulted in tragedy, not just for her but for the bear as well. If she'd been killed or seriously injured, the bear might have been hunted down and euthanized, all for the sake of a photograph. As the ranger finished tending to her scrapes, Emily made a silent vow. If she was lucky enough to make it out of this experience, she would never again take such risks. The beauty of nature was meant to be respected, not exploited. With a Park Service escort, Emily returned to her campsite to collect her belongings. As she packed up her tent, her gaze kept drifting to the tree line, half expecting to see the bear watching her. But the forest remained still and silent, its secrets kept hidden behind a veil of green. That night, safely ensconced in the ranger station's visitor center, Emily scrolled through the photos on her camera. The images of the bear were breathtaking, intimate portraits of a wild creature in its natural habitat. But as she looked at them, all Emily could see was her own hubris, her dangerous disregard for the power of the wild. With a heavy heart, she selected all the bear photos and pressed delete. Some moments, she realized, weren't meant to be captured. They were meant to be experienced, respected, and ultimately left in the wild where they belonged. Emily woke with a start, her heart racing as the memories of the bear encounter flooded back. She was safe in the ranger station's spare room, but the fear lingered like a bad taste in her mouth. Sunlight streamed through the window, signaling the start of a new day. Despite the park ranger's insistence that she should leave Denali after such a close call, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her work here wasn't finished. She dressed quickly and made her way to the station's common area, where Ranger Mike was reviewing reports at a cluttered desk. "Morning, Emily," he said, looking up from his paperwork. "How are you feeling?" Emily managed a weak smile. "Better, thanks. Still a bit shaken, but I've been thinking." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I want to stay," Emily said, the words tumbling out. "I know it sounds crazy after what happened, but I came here to document the wildlife of Denali. I can't leave after one setback." Mike leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of concern and admiration. "Emily, what you experienced wasn't just a setback. You could have been killed." "I know," Emily said, her voice firm. "And I've learned my lesson. I'll keep my distance, use telephoto lenses, follow every safety protocol to the letter, but I can't let fear drive me away from my passion." The ranger studied her for a long moment before sighing. "I can't force you to leave, but I strongly advise against staying. That bear is still out there, and it's shown aggressive behavior." Emily nodded, understanding his concern. "I appreciate that, but I promise I'll be more careful than anyone has ever been in the history of wildlife photography." Mike chuckled despite himself. All right, but you check in with us every day, understood? And at the first sign of trouble, you're out of here." "Deal," Emily said, relief washing over her. After a hearty breakfast and a thorough review of bear safety protocols, Emily set out to reclaim her campsite. The forest seemed different now, its beauty tinged with an undercurrent of danger that she hadn't fully appreciated before. Every rustle in the underbrush made her tense, her hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on her hip. As she approached her old campsite, Emily slowed her pace, scanning the area carefully. The clearing appeared undisturbed, no sign of the bear that had so terrified her just days before. She began to set up her tent, constantly glancing over her shoulder, hyper-aware of her surroundings. Just as she was hammering in the last tent stake, a voice called out, making her jump. "Whoa, easy there, didn't mean to startle you." Emily whirled around to see a man in his early 30s, his beard scruffy and his backpack well worn. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Sorry about that," he said. "I'm Jason. Saw your campsite and thought I'd say hello. Not too many solo campers out this way." Emily's heart rate slowly returned to normal. "I'm Emily," she replied, offering a tentative smile. "Wildlife photographer, or at least trying to be." Jason's eyes lit up. "No kidding? I'm actually out here tracking bear movements for a research project. Any luck with the local wildlife?" Emily's smile faltered. "You could say that. Had a pretty close encounter with a black bear a couple days ago. It charged me." Jason's expression turned serious. "Damn, are you all right? Did you report it?" Emily nodded, recounting the experience in halting sentences. As she spoke, she was surprised to find the fear loosening its grip on her. Talking about it seemed to diminish its power. "That's intense," Jason said when she finished. "Most black bears are pretty skittish around humans. Sounds like you might have surprised it." "Maybe," Emily said, though she couldn't shake the memory of the bear's curious, almost friendly demeanor the night before the attack. "I thought I was being careful, but clearly I misjudged the situation." Jason nodded sympathetically. "It happens to the best of us. The important thing is, you're okay. But listen, if you're planning to stay out here, maybe we could team up. Safety and numbers and all that." Emily hesitated. She'd come to Denali for solitude, to commune with nature on her own terms. But after her experience, the idea of having someone watching her back was undeniably appealing. That might not be a bad idea," she said slowly. "What did you have in mind?" Over the next hour, Emily and Jason compared notes and plans. His research focused on tracking bear movements and behavior, which complemented her photography goals perfectly. They agreed to camp separately but meet each morning to plan their routes and check in throughout the day via handheld radios. As the sun began to set, Jason bid her good night and headed back to his own campsite. Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The forest didn't seem quite so threatening now that she wasn't facing it entirely alone. That night, as Emily reviewed her camera settings by the light of her lantern, a twig snapped in the darkness, beyond her campsite. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she reached for her flashlight, her other hand hovering near the bear spray. The beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating nothing. The forest was still, no sign of movement. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she scanned the tree line, expecting at any moment to see the bear's eyes reflecting in the darkness, but there was nothing. After several tense minutes, Emily allowed herself to relax slightly. Probably just a squirrel or a bird, she told herself. No need to panic over every little sound. Still, sleep was hard to come by that night. Emily tossed and turned, her dreams filled with charging bears and endless maze-like forests. She woke before dawn, gritty-eyed, but determined to make the most of the day. As agreed, she met Jason at the trailhead. He looked annoyingly well-rested and chipper. "Morning, sunshine," he grinned. "Ready to find some bears? You know, from a safe distance this time." Emily managed a wry smile. "Ha ha! Lead the way, bear man." They set off into the forest, Jason occasionally stopping to check tracks or scat. Emily kept her camera at the ready, capturing the morning light filtering through the trees. A red fox. Darting across their path, a majestic bull moose glimpsed through the foliage. As the day wore on, Emily found herself relaxing. The forest was alive with beauty, and having Jason there allowed her to focus on her photography without constantly looking over her shoulder. It was mid-afternoon when Jason held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He pointed silently to a clearing ahead. Emily's breath caught in her throat. There, not 50 yards away, was a black bear. Her black bear. "That's him," she whispered to Jason. "That's the one that charged me." Jason nodded, his expression serious. "Okay, we're downwind, so he hasn't noticed us yet. Remember, slow movements, no direct eye contact. You want to get some shots?" Emily hesitated. Part of her wanted to turn and run to put as much distance between herself and the bear as possible. But a stronger part, the part that had driven her to become a wildlife photographer in the first place, knew this was a rare opportunity. "Yeah," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Yeah, I do." Slowly, carefully, Emily raised her camera. The bear was foraging in the underbrush, unaware of their presence. Through her telephoto lens, she could see every detail. The texture of its fur, the powerful muscles rippling beneath its skin, the intelligent gleam in its eyes. Click, click, click. Emily's finger moved on the shutter button, almost of its own accord, capturing image after image. The bear lifted its head, seeming to look directly at her through the lens. Emily's breath caught in her throat. For a long moment, time seemed to stand still. The bear regarded them calmly, showing no sign of the aggression it had displayed days before. Then, with a dismissive huff, it turned and ambled back into the forest. Emily lowered her camera, her hands shaking slightly. "Wow," she breathed. Jason grinned at her. "Now that's more like it. Proper wildlife encounter, safe distance, great photos. How do you feel?" Emily considered the question. The fear was still there, a low hum in the back of her mind, but it was overshadowed by a sense of awe, of privilege at having witnessed such a moment. "I feel good," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Like I'm finally doing what I came here to do." As they made their way back to the campsite, Emily felt a shift within herself. The forest was still wild, still dangerous, but she was starting to understand her place in it, not as a conqueror or even an observer, but as a guest granted fleeting glimpses into a world both beautiful and perilous. That night, as Emily reviewed her photos by the campfire, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The bear that had terrified her days before now seemed less like a monster and more like what it truly was, a wild creature living its life in its natural habitat. She had come to Denali seeking a connection with nature, and in the most unexpected way she had found it. The challenge now would be to maintain that connection while respecting the boundaries between her world and the wild one she had come to document. As the fire burned low and the stars emerged in the clear Alaskan sky, Emily made a silent promise to herself and to the wilderness around her. She would tell its stories, capture its beauty, but always with the respect and caution it deserved. For in the end, she was just a visitor in this vast, untamed land, privileged to witness its wonders but never truly a part of it. With that thought, Emily zipped up her tent and drifted off to sleep, the soft sounds of the forest a soothing lullaby. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and hopefully, new insights into the delicate balance between humans and the wild world they sought to understand. The night air was crisp and cold, a stark reminder of the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. Emily shivered in her sleeping bag, pulling it tighter around her shoulders. Sleep had been elusive, her mind racing with the day's events and the lingering fear that never quite left her. A twig snapped outside her tent, and Emily's eyes flew open, her heart hammering in her chest. She held her breath, straining to hear over the sound of blood rushing in her ears. Another snap, closer this time. "Jason?" she called out tentatively, hoping it was her new companion checking on her. No response came. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Emily's hand inched towards the bear spray she kept beside her pillow, her fingers curling around the canister. Just as she began to relax, convincing herself it was merely her imagination, a low, huffing breath sounded just outside her tent. Emily's blood ran cold. She knew that sound. The bear had returned. The tent fabric bulged inward as something large pressed against it. Emily bit back a scream, her entire body trembling. She fumbled for the flashlight, clicking it on with shaking hands. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the massive silhouette pressed against her tent. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "Get out of here!" The bear's response was immediate and terrifying. With a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, it slammed its weight against the tent. The flimsy structure buckled, collapsing around Emily in a tangle of nylon and poles. Panic surged through her as she fought to free herself from the fabric. She could hear the bear's heavy breathing, feel the vibrations of its movements through the ground. In her frantic struggle, the bear spray slipped from her grasp, disappearing into the folds of the collapsed tent. "Help!" Emily screamed, hoping against hope that Jason or a park ranger might hear her. "Somebody help me!" The tent fabric ripped, and Emily found herself face to face with the bear. Its hot breath washed over her, the stench of rotting meat making her gag. Time seemed to slow as she stared into its dark eyes, seeing not the curious creature from days before, but a primal force of nature, indifferent to her fear. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily kicked out, her foot connecting with the bear's snout. It reared back, momentarily stunned, giving her the opening she needed. She scrambled backwards, finally freeing herself from the remains of the tent. The forest loomed around her, dark and imposing. Emily's mind raced, trying to remember the bear safety training she'd received, play dead for grizzlies, fight back against black bears. But in the moment, faced with hundreds of pounds of muscle and claw, all rational thought fled. She ran. Branches whipped at her face as she crashed through, the underbrush blind with terror. She could hear the bear behind her, its heavy footfalls shaking the earth. Emily's lungs burned, her legs trembling with each step, but fear drove her onward. A root caught her foot, sending her sprawling. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Gasping, she rolled over, expecting to feel the bear's claws tearing into her at any moment. Instead, she found herself staring up at the night sky, a brilliant tapestry of stars visible through a break in the canopy. For a surreal moment, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. If this was to be her last sight, at least it was beautiful. The bear's roar shattered the illusion. Emily scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain shooting through her ankle. She limped forward, no longer running but simply stumbling through the darkness, each step a desperate bid for survival. The sound of rushing water reached her ears, growing louder with each passing moment. Emily broke through the tree line, finding herself on the banks of a swift-moving river. The bear crashed out of the forest behind her, leaving her trapped between the raging water and the advancing predator. Time seemed to slow as Emily weighed her options. The river was dangerous, its waters cold and fast, filled with hidden rocks and currents. But the bear was a certainty, its intent clear in its gleaming eyes and bared teeth. Taking a deep breath, Emily made her choice. She turned and plunged into the icy water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. The current immediately swept her off her feet, tumbling her downstream. Emily fought to keep her head above water, gasping for air between the waves that crashed over her. Rocks loomed in the darkness, their edges sharp and unforgiving. Emily's body slammed against them, each impact sending shock waves of pain through her. She could taste blood in her mouth, feel it trickling down her face from a gash on her forehead. Just as her strength began to fail, her hand brushed against something solid, a tree branch extending out over the water. With the last reserves of her energy, Emily grabbed hold, pulling herself towards the shore. She dragged herself onto the rocky bank, coughing and retching. Every inch of her body screamed in pain, but she was alive. Emily collapsed onto her back, staring up at the star-filled sky, her chest heaving as she gulped in air. The sound of something large moving through the water snapped her back to reality. Emily's head whipped around, her eyes widening in disbelief. The bear had followed her into the river. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "No, no, no." She tried to stand, but her battered body refused to cooperate. All she could do was watch. As the bear pulled itself from the water, shaking its fur in a spray of droplets that glimmered in the moonlight, Emily closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She thought of her family, her friends, all the things she'd left unsaid. A sob escaped her lips, a final release of fear and regret. The bear's huffing breath grew closer. Emily could feel its presence looming over her. She opened her eyes, determined to face her end with whatever courage she could muster. But the attack never came. The bear stood over her, its dark eyes regarding her with what almost seemed like curiosity. It sniffed at her, its wet nose brushing against her arm. Emily held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the bear turned away. It lumbered back towards the forest, pausing at the tree line to look back at her one last time before disappearing into the darkness. Emily lay there, stunned. The danger had passed, but the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was injured, soaking wet, and lost in the Alaskan wilderness in the middle of the night. Hypothermia was a very real threat, and she had no idea how to find her way. Back to camp. With a groan of pain, Emily forced herself to sit up. She had to move to find shelter and warmth. As she struggled to her feet, a faint sound caught her attention, a voice calling out in the distance, "Emily! Emily, where are you?" Relief washed over her. It was Jason. Somehow he had heard her. "Screams and come looking for her." "Here," she called back, her voice weak but determined. "I'm over here." Minutes later, Jason burst through the trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He rushed to her side, his face pale with concern. "My God, Emily," he breathed, taking in her battered appearance. "What happened? Are you okay?" Emily managed a weak smile. "The bear, it came back. I ran, fell in the river." Jason wrapped an emergency blanket around her shoulders, his hands gentle as he checked her for serious injuries. "You're lucky to be alive. Come on, let's get you back to camp. Can you walk?" With Jason's support, Emily limped through the forest. Each step was agony, but the warmth of the blanket and the knowledge that she was no longer alone gave her strength. As they neared the campsite, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. "I thought I was going to die," Emily said softly as Jason helped her into his tent. "But the bear, it just looked at me and left. I don't understand." Jason shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Bears are complex creatures. It's possible it was just curious, or maybe it decided you weren't worth the effort after the chase. Either way, you're incredibly fortunate." As Jason tended to her injuries and called for emergency evacuation, Emily found her thoughts drifting back to the bear. Despite the terror of the chase, the final moment of their encounter stayed with her. There had been something in the bear's eyes, a glimmer of intelligence or understanding that she couldn't quite explain. The sound of an approaching helicopter broke through her musings. As the paramedics loaded her into the aircraft, Emily took One last look at the vast Alaskan wilderness stretching out below. She had come seeking a connection with nature, and she had found it in the most primal, terrifying way possible. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying her towards safety and medical attention, Emily made a silent vow. She would return one day, not as a conqueror or even merely an observer, but as a student of the wild. For in those dark moments by the river, facing death and finding an unexpected reprieve, she had glimpsed a truth about nature and her place in it that would take a lifetime to fully understand. The wilderness of Denali faded into the distance, but its mark on Emily's soul would remain forever. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room made Emily's head throb. She lay in the sterile bed, her body a patchwork of bandages and bruises, each breath a reminder of her harrowing encounter in the Alaskan wilderness. The steady beep of the heart monitor provided a rhythmic backdrop to her tumultuous thoughts. Soft knock at the door drew her attention. "Come in," she called, her voice still raspy from screaming. Jason entered, his face etched with concern. "Hey there, survivor. How are you feeling?" Emily managed a weak smile. "Like I went 10 rounds with a bear and lost." Jason pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Well, from what I hear, you held your own pretty well. The doctors say you're lucky to be alive." "Lucky," Emily repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. She closed her eyes, the memories of that night flooding back. The terror of the bear's hot breath, the icy shock of the river, the strange moment of connection before the animal retreated. "I don't feel lucky." Jason leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Emily, you survived something that most people wouldn't. That's not luck, that's strength." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I was stupid, Jason. I put myself in that situation. I ignored all the warnings, all the safety protocols. I could have died." "But you didn't," Jason insisted. "And now, you have a story to tell, a perspective that few people have." Emily shook her head, wincing at the movement. "I don't know if I want to tell this story. I don't know if I can face that world again." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A park ranger entered, his face grave. "Ms. Robinson?" "I'm Ranger Thompson. I need to ask you a few questions about the incident, if you're up for it." Emily nodded, steeling herself. As she recounted the events of that night, each detail brought the terror rushing back. The collapse of her tent, the frantic chase through the forest, the plunge into the icy river. But it was the final moment, the bear's curious gaze before it retreated, that gave her pause. "And you're certain the bear didn't attack you after you exited the river?" Ranger Thompson asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "Yes," Emily confirmed. It just looked at me, then it left." The ranger's brow furrowed. "That's unusual behavior for a black bear, especially one that had been aggressive earlier. We'll need to monitor the area closely. This bear could pose a significant threat to other campers." Emily felt a sudden pang of concern. "What does that mean? What will happen to the bear?" Ranger Thompson's expression was carefully neutral. "If we determine that this bear is a habitual threat, we may need to take action to ensure public safety." "Oh, you mean kill it?" Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. The ranger didn't deny it. "It's always a last resort, but the safety of park visitors has to be our top priority." After the ranger left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Jason watched Emily, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay?" Emily stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. "I don't know. I was terrified. I thought I was going to die, but the bear, it could have killed me easily. It chose not to. Does that count for nothing?" Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Emily. Wild animals, they don't think like we do. What seems like mercy to us might just be disinterest or confusion to them." "But it was curious," Emily insisted, struggling to sit up. "At the end, when it looked at me by the river, there was something in its eyes, Jason. Intelligence. Understanding, maybe." "Emily," Jason said gently, "you'd been through a traumatic experience. You were injured, probably in shock. It's natural to try to find meaning in what happened, but don't," Emily cut him off. "Don't patronize me. I know what I saw." The days that followed were a blur of medical tests, police interviews, and visits from concerned friends and family. Emily's story had made the local news, painting her as a survivor of a vicious bear attack. But each retelling felt hollow, incomplete. They focused on the chase, the danger, the narrow escape. None of them captured the moment that haunted Emily's dreams, that final curious look from the bear. A week after the incident, Emily was cleared to leave the hospital. As Jason helped her into his truck for the drive back to Anchorage, she found herself staring out at the vast Alaskan landscape. "You're awfully quiet," Jason observed as they wound their way through the mountains. Emily sighed. "I've been thinking about the bear, about what Ranger Thompson said." Jason glanced at her, his expression wary. "Emily, you're not thinking of going back out there, are you?" She turned to face him, determination glinting in her eyes. "I have to, Jason. I can't let them kill that bear because of me." "Whoa, hold on," Jason said, pulling the truck over to the side of the road. He turned to face her fully. "Emily, you nearly died. That bear, whether it meant to or not, put you in the hospital. You can't seriously be thinking of defending it." Emily met his gaze steadily. "I'm not defending its actions, but I am questioning ours. We go into their territory, we disrupt their lives, and then we punish them for reacting. It's not right, Jason." "And what do you think you can do about it?" Jason asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "You're not a wildlife expert, Emily. You're a photographer who got in over her head." His words stung, but Emily refused to back down. "Maybe that's exactly what's needed. Someone who's seen both sides. Someone who can show people the beauty and the danger. Help them understand." Jason shook his head, starting the truck back up. "I think you're making a mistake, Emily. But I can see there's no talking you out of it." As they continued their journey, Emily's mind raced with possibilities. She knew she couldn't just march back into the wilderness, not in her current condition, but maybe there was another way to make a difference. Over the next few weeks, as her body healed, Emily threw herself into research. She pored over books on bear behavior, studied wilderness safety protocols, and reached out to wildlife photographers who specialized in capturing images of large predators. Each night, she dreamed of dark eyes and gleaming fur, of the thin line between fear and understanding. Finally, when she felt ready, Emily called Ranger Thompson. "Ms. Robinson," the ranger greeted her, surprise evident in his voice. "How can I help you?" Emily took a deep breath. "I want to propose a project, a photographic study of the bear that I encountered. I want to tell its story, and the story of how we coexist with these animals in their natural habitat." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Robinson, I hope you understand how unusual and potentially dangerous this request is." "I do," Emily assured him, "but I also understand that I have a unique perspective. I've seen the danger these animals can pose, but I've also seen their capacity for something else. Curiosity, maybe, or restraint. I think that's a story worth telling." Another pause, shorter this time. "You'd need to undergo extensive safety training, and we'd need to put strict protocols in place." "Of course," Emily agreed quickly. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." As she hung up the phone, Emily felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She knew the path ahead would be challenging, possibly even dangerous, but she also knew it was necessary. For herself, for the bear, and for all those who ventured into the wild seeking connection with nature. She picked up her camera, running her fingers over the familiar contours. It had survived the encounter better than she had, protected by its waterproof case. Emily raised it to her eye, focusing on the distant mountains visible through her window. Click. The sound of the shutter was like a promise, a commitment to the journey ahead. Emily lowered the camera, a small smile playing on her lips. She had come to Alaska seeking a profound encounter with nature. She had found it in the most unexpected and terrifying way possible. Now, it was time to share that encounter with the world, to bridge the gap between human fear and wild beauty. As the sun set over the Alaskan landscape, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Emily felt a sense of purpose settle over her. The bear had spared her life that night by the river. Now she would do everything in her power to return the favor, one photograph at a time. The crisp Alaskan air bit at Emily's cheeks as she tightened the straps on her backpack. Her hands, still bearing faint scars from her previous encounter, trembled slightly as she double-checked her gear. The weight of her camera around her neck was both familiar and strange, a reminder of why she was here and what she had been through. "Are you sure about this, Emily?" Jason's voice was tight with concern. He stood a few feet away, his own pack, ready, acting as both guide and protector on this expedition. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. I have to do this, Jason, for myself and for the bear. Ranger Thompson approached, his face a mask of professional concern. Remember, at the first sign of danger, we abort. No exceptions. Your safety is our top priority. Emily nodded, her jaw set with determination. Understood. Let's go. The small group set off into the wilderness of Denali National Park. Emily's steps were cautious at first, her body remembering the terror of her last journey into these woods. But as they hiked deeper into the forest, a sense of calm began to settle over her. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable. Towering spruce trees, their branches heavy with early morning dew, and the distant peaks of snow-capped mountains, peeking through the canopy. As they paused for a water break, Emily raised her camera, capturing the interplay of light and shadow on the forest floor. The familiar act of framing a shot helped to ground her, to remind her why she had returned to this place that had nearly claimed her life. Track here, Jason called out softly, crouching near a muddy patch of ground. Emily moved closer, her heart rate quickening, as she saw the distinct imprint of a bear's paw. Is it him? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason studied the print carefully. Hard to say for certain, but it's the right size. And it's fresh. Can't be more than a few hours old. Ranger Thompson's hand moved to the tranquilizer, gun at his hip, a motion that didn't escape Emily's notice. We'll follow the trail but maintain a safe distance. Miss Robinson, are you comfortable proceeding? Emily nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, let's keep going. They moved deeper into the forest, following the bear's trail. Emily's senses were on high alert, every snapping twig and rustling leaf sending a jolt of adrenaline through her system. But beneath the fear there was something else, a growing sense of excitement, of anticipation. As they crested a small hill, Jason suddenly held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. There, he whispered, pointing to a clearing below. Emily's breath caught in her throat. There, not 50 yards away, was a black bear. Its glossy fur shone in the dappled sunlight as it foraged among the underbrush, unaware of their presence. Is it him? Ranger Thompson asked quietly, his hand still resting on his weapon. Emily raised her camera, zooming in on the bear's face. As she did, it lifted its head, seeming to look directly at her through the lens. In that moment, a shock of recognition passed through her. It's him, she breathed, lowering the camera. I'm sure of it. The bear continued to watch them, its dark eyes inscrutable. Emily felt frozen in place, caught between fear and fascination. This was the creature that had chased her through the forest, that had nearly ended her life, and yet it was also the being that had spared her in that final moment by the river. Slowly, carefully, Emily raised her camera again. The shutter clicked softly as she captured image after image, documenting every move the bear made. It seemed content to ignore them, returning to its foraging, but Emily could sense its awareness of their presence. Incredible, Jason murmured. It's so calm. Most bears would have bolted by now with this many humans around. Ranger Thompson nodded, his expression a mix of awe and concern. It's unusual behavior, that's for sure. We'll need to monitor this situation closely. As they watched, the bear began to move away from the clearing, disappearing into the dense underbrush. Emily felt a sudden panic, an irrational fear that she might never see it again. We have to follow it, she said, taking a step forward. Jason grabbed her arm, holding her back. Emily, no, it's too dangerous. We've got some great shots, let's not push our luck. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more to understand about this complex creature. Please, she said, looking from Jason to Ranger Thompson. Just a little further. I'll be careful, I promise. After a moment of tense silence, Ranger Thompson nodded reluctantly. All right, but we maintain a greater distance, and at the first sign of aggression, we're out of here. They followed the bear's trail, moving as quietly as possible through the forest. Emily's heart raced with each step, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. This was what she had come back for, not just to photograph the bear, but to understand it, to bridge the gap between their worlds. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Emily gasped. The bear stood at the edge of a small stream, its massive paws dipping into the water as it fished for salmon. The scene was so peaceful, so at odds with her previous encounter, that Emily felt tears prick at her eyes. She raised her camera, capturing the moment. The bear turned at the sound of the shutter, its gaze locking onto Emily. Time seemed to stand still as they regarded each other, human and animal, separated by mere yards and millions of years of evolution. In that moment, Emily understood something profound. The bear wasn't a monster, wasn't a mindless killing machine. It was a creature of instinct and intelligence, as much a part of this wilderness as the trees and the mountains. And she, Emily, was the intruder here. Slowly, deliberately, Emily lowered her camera. She took a step back, then another, maintaining eye contact with the bear. It watched her, its expression unreadable, but made no move to approach or flee. "Emily," Jason hissed, "what are you doing?" She held up a hand, silencing him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she addressed the bear. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry for intruding, for not respecting your space. Thank you for sparing me that night. I understand now." The bear tilted its head as if considering her words. Then, with a soft huff, it turned and ambled back into the forest, disappearing from view. Emily let out a shaky breath, her legs suddenly weak. Jason rushed to her side, supporting her as she sank to the ground. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I understand now, Jason. I finally understand." Ranger Thompson crouched beside them, his expression a mix of concern and awe. "Ms. Robinson, I've been working with wildlife for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that. You have a gift." As they made their way back to the ranger station, Emily's mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. She had come seeking closure, seeking understanding, and she had found it in the most unexpected way possible. Back at the station, as Emily reviewed her photographs, she felt a sense of purpose crystallize within her. These images, this story, had the power to change how people viewed these magnificent creatures, to foster understanding and respect, rather than fear and aggression. "What now?" Jason asked, looking over her shoulder at the stunning images on her camera's display. Emily smiled, a plan already forming in her mind. "Now, we tell their story. We show the world that these animals aren't just dangerous predators, but complex, intelligent beings deserving of our respect and protection." As the sun set over Denali, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had come to Alaska seeking a profound encounter with nature, and she had found it in the most unexpected and terrifying way possible. Now armed with her camera and a newfound understanding, she was ready to share that encounter with the world, one photograph at a time. The bear that had once been her nightmare had become her muse, her teacher, her connection to the wild heart of nature, and in that connection, Emily had found not just her story but her calling. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room cast a sickly pallor over Emily's skin as she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the past few days in an endless loop. The steady beep of the heart monitor provided a rhythmic backdrop to her tumultuous thoughts. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. "Come in," she called, her voice still raspy from screaming during the bear encounter. "Doctor." Larson entered, his face a mask of professional concern. "How are we feeling today, Ms. Robinson?" Emily managed a weak smile. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly and lost." The doctor chuckled softly as he checked her vitals. "Well, considering what you've been through, I'd say you're doing remarkably well. Your physical injuries are healing." "Nicely, but," Emily prompted, sensing the unspoken caveat in his tone. Dr. Larson sighed, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "But I'm concerned about your mental state. Trauma like this, it can leave scars that aren't visible to the naked eye." Emily closed her eyes, the memories washing over her once again. The terror of the bear's hot breath, the icy shock of the river, the strange moment of connection before the animal retreated. "I keep seeing it," she whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there." The doctor nodded sympathetically. That's normal, Emily. You've experienced something incredibly traumatic. It's going to take time to process. But that's just it, Emily said, opening her eyes to meet the doctor's gaze. It's not just fear I'm feeling. It's something else. Something I can't quite explain. Before Dr. Larson could respond, there was another knock at the door. Jason entered, his face lighting up when he saw Emily awake. "Hey, survivor, how are you feeling?" Emily forced a smile. "Better, thanks. Dr. Larson was just telling me how well I'm healing." The doctor stood, offering Jason his chair. "Physically, yes, but Emily, I want you to consider speaking with our trauma counselor. What you've been through, it's not something you should try to deal with alone." After the doctor left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Jason watched Emily, concern etched on his face. "He's right, you know. You don't have to go through this alone." Emily stared out the window, her mind far away in the Alaskan wilderness. "I don't know how to explain it, Jason. I was terrified. I thought I was going to die. But there was a moment at the end when the bear looked at me. I saw something in its eyes. Intelligence. Understanding, maybe." Jason leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Emily, you'd been through a traumatic experience. You were injured, probably in shock. It's natural to try to find meaning in what happened." "But don't," Emily cut him off, her voice sharp. "Don't patronize me. I know what I saw." The days that followed were a blur of medical tests, police interviews, and visits from concerned friends and family. Emily's story had made the local news, painting her as a survivor of a vicious bear attack. But each retelling felt hollow, incomplete. They focused on the chase, the danger, the narrow escape. None of them captured the moment that haunted Emily's dreams. That final, curious look from the bear. A week after the incident, Emily was cleared to leave the hospital. As she packed her few belongings, a park ranger appeared in her doorway. "Ms. Robinson, I'm Ranger Thompson. I was hoping we could talk about what happened in the park." Emily nodded, bracing herself for another retelling. But as she recounted the events once more, she found herself focusing on that final moment by the river. The ranger listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That's unusual behavior for a black bear," he said when she finished, "especially one that had been aggressive earlier. We'll need to monitor the area closely. This bear could pose a significant threat to other campers." Emily felt a sudden pang of concern. "What does that mean? What will happen to the bear?" "Ranger." Thompson's expression was carefully neutral. "If we determine that this bear is a habitual threat, we may need to take action to ensure public safety." "You mean kill it," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. The ranger didn't deny it. It's always a last resort, but the safety of park visitors has to be our top priority." As Ranger Thompson left, Emily sank onto the bed, her mind racing. The thought of the bear being killed because of her mistake filled her with a deep sense of guilt and regret. Jason found her there an hour later, still lost in thought. "Ready to go? The discharge papers are all signed?" Emily looked up at him, determination glinting in her eyes. "I can't let them kill that bear, Jason," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emily, you're not thinking clearly. That animal nearly killed you." "But it didn't," she insisted. "It could have easily, but it chose not to. Doesn't that count for something?" Jason sat beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "It's a wild animal, Emily. It doesn't think like we do. What seems like mercy to us might just be disinterest or confusion to them." Emily shook her head, struggling to find the words to express what she was feeling. "I can't explain it, Jason, but I know there was more to that moment than just animal instinct. I have to do something." Over the next few weeks, as her body healed, Emily threw herself into research. She pored over books on bear behavior, studied wilderness safety protocols, and reached out to wildlife photographers who specialized in capturing images of large predators. Each night, she dreamed of dark eyes and gleaming fur, of the thin line between fear and understanding. Finally, when she felt ready, Emily called Ranger Thompson. "Ms. Robinson," the ranger greeted her, surprise evident in his voice. "How can I help you?" Emily took a deep breath. "I want to propose a project, a photographic study of the bear that I encountered. I want to tell its story and the story of how we coexist with these animals in their natural habitat. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ms. Robinson, I hope you understand how unusual and potentially dangerous this request is. I do, Emily assured him. But I also understand that I have a unique perspective. I've seen the danger these animals can pose, but I've also seen their capacity for something else. Curiosity, maybe, or restraint. I think that's a story. Worth telling. Another pause, shorter this time. You'd need to undergo extensive safety training, and we'd need to put strict protocols in place. Of course, Emily agreed quickly. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes. As she hung up the phone, Emily felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She knew the path ahead would be challenging, possibly even dangerous. But she also knew it was necessary. For herself, for the bear, and for all those who ventured into the wild seeking connection with nature. The next month was a whirlwind of preparation. Emily underwent intensive wilderness survival training, learned advanced techniques for safely photographing large predators, and worked with park officials to develop a comprehensive safety plan for her project. Finally, the day arrived for her, to return to Denali. As she stood at the trailhead, her camera heavy around her neck, Emily felt a familiar mix of fear and excitement coursing through her veins. Jason appeared at her side, his own pack laden with gear. Last chance to back out, he said, only half joking. Emily shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. Not a chance. I need to do this, Jason, for myself and for the bear. As they set off into the wilderness, Emily felt a sense of purpose settle over her. She had come to Alaska seeking a profound encounter with nature. She had found it, in the most unexpected and terrifying way possible. Now it was time to share that encounter with the world, to bridge the gap between human fear and wild beauty. The forest welcomed them back. The towering spruce trees and distant mountain peaks a reminder of both the beauty and the danger that lurked in this untamed land. Emily raised her camera, capturing the interplay of light and shadow on the forest floor. With each step, she felt herself moving closer not just to the bear, but to a deeper understanding of her place in this wild world. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Emily and Jason made camp for the night. Sitting by the fire, Emily reviewed the day's photographs, each image a step towards telling the complex story of human-wildlife interaction. What do you hope to achieve with all this, Emily? Jason asked, his voice soft in the gathering. Darkness. Emily looked up from her camera, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. Understanding, she said simply. For myself, for the bear, for anyone who sees these images. I want people to see these animals as more than just threats or attractions. They're complex, intelligent beings, worthy of our respect and protection. She spoke. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond their campfire. Emily and Jason froze, their eyes straining to pierce the gloom. For a moment all was still. Then at the edge of the firelight, a large shape emerged. The bear stood there, its dark eyes reflecting the flames as it regarded them calmly. Emily's heart raced, but not with fear this time. Slowly, carefully, she raised her camera. Click. The sound of the shutter was like a promise, a commitment to the journey ahead. The bear huffed softly, then turned and melted back into the forest. Emily lowered her camera, a sense of awe washing over her. Did you see that? She whispered to Jason, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his eyes wide. I saw it. I'm not sure I believe it, but I saw it. As the night deepened around them, Emily felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She had taken the first step on a journey that would challenge her, frighten her, and ultimately transform her. But with each image captured, each moment, of connection forged, she knew she was moving closer to understanding not just the bear, but the wild heart of nature itself. And in that understanding, Emily had found not just her story, but her calling. The soft beeping of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Emily slowly regained consciousness. Her body felt heavy, each breath a reminder of her encounter with the bear. As her eyes fluttered open, she saw Jason slumped in a chair. Beside her bed, his face etched with worry. Jason? She croaked, her throat dry and raw. He jerked awake, relief washing over his features. Emily, thank God. How are you feeling? Emily tried to sit up but winced at the pain that shot through her body. Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly, she managed, attempting a weak smile. Jason helped her take a sip of water. The doctors say you're lucky to be alive. When I found you by that river, I thought... His voice trailed off, and Emily could see the fear and anguish in his eyes. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. I'm okay, Jason, I'm still here. A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Dr. Larson entered, clipboard in hand. Ms. Robinson, it's good to see you awake. How are you feeling? Emily took stock of her body, cataloguing the various aches and pains. Everything hurts, but I'm alive. That's something, right? The doctor nodded, his expression serious. Indeed it is. You've suffered multiple lacerations, a mild concussion, and hypothermia. But considering what you went through, you're remarkably lucky. As Dr. Larson began checking her vitals, Emily's mind drifted back to the forest, to the moment when the bear had her cornered by the river. Doctor, she said hesitantly, is it normal to feel a connection with the animal that attacked you? The doctor paused, looking at her curiously. What do you mean by connection, Ms. Robinson? Emily struggled to find the words. When the bear had me trapped, there was a moment. I looked into its eyes and I saw, I don't know, intelligence? Understanding? It sounds crazy, I know. Doctor... Larson exchanged a glance with Jason before responding. Emily, you went through an extremely traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to try to make sense of such events, to assign meaning where there might not be any. But it felt real, Emily insisted, like there was a moment of communication between us. The doctor's voice was gentle but firm. What you're experiencing is likely a combination of the trauma and your body's survival instincts. I'd like you to speak with our trauma counselor once you're feeling up to it. Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her experience than mere trauma-induced delusion. Over the next few days, a parade of visitors came through Emily's room. Park rangers took her statement, journalists sought interviews, and well-wishers brought flowers and cards. But through it all, Emily found her thoughts returning to the bear, to that moment of connection by the river. One afternoon, as she was flipping through a nature magazine Jason had brought her, a story caught her eye. It was about a wildlife photographer who specialized in capturing images of large predators in their natural habitats. Jason, she said, excitement creeping into her voice, look at this photographer. She gets so close to these animals, the images are incredible. Jason glanced at the article, frowning. Emily, you can't be thinking... Why not? She countered. I've always wanted to do more with my photography, to tell important stories. What if this is my chance? Jason ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his voice. Emily, you nearly died. You can't seriously be considering going back out there. Not right away, she conceded. But eventually. Jason, I need to understand what happened out there. I need to tell this story. Before Jason could respond, there was a knock at the door. Ranger Thompson entered, his expression grave. Ms. Robinson, I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to update you on the situation with the bear. Emily felt her heart rate quicken. What's happening? The ranger sighed, taking a seat. We've been monitoring the area where your attack occurred. The bear has been spotted several times, exhibiting unusually bold behavior around humans. We're concerned it may be becoming habituated. What does that mean? Emily asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. It means, Ranger Thompson said slowly, that we may need to take action to ensure public safety. If the bear continues to show aggressive behavior towards humans, you'll kill it, Emily finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The ranger nodded solemnly. It would be a last resort, but yes, that's a possibility we have to consider. Emily felt a surge of panic. No, you can't. That bear, it had the chance to kill me, but it didn't. Doesn't that count for something? Ranger Thompson's voice was sympathetic but firm. I understand how you feel, Ms. Robinson, but we have to prioritize human safety. One moment of perceived mercy doesn't negate the danger this animal poses. After the ranger left, Emily lay in silence, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow responsible for the bear's fate. If it was killed because of their encounter, Could she live with that, Jason? She said finally, turning to her friend. I need your help. He looked at her warily. With what? Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. I want to go back, to document the bear, to tell its story, to show that these animals are more than just threats to be eliminated. Jason stared at her in disbelief. Emily, that's insane. You're still recovering, and even if you weren't, going back there would be incredibly dangerous. I know, she admitted. But I can't just sit here and do nothing while they decide whether to kill that bear. I need to understand what happened out there, Jason, and I need to help others understand too. For a long moment, Jason was silent. Then, with a resigned sigh, he said, You're not going to let this go, are you? Emily shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. Not a chance. Then I guess I'd better come with you, Jason said. Someone's got to keep you from getting eaten. Over the next few weeks, as Emily's body healed, her determination only grew stronger. She threw herself into research, studying bear behavior, wilderness survival techniques, and the work of other wildlife photographers. She reached out to experts, attended lectures, and practiced her photography skills from the confines of her hospital room. Finally, the day came when Dr. Larson declared her fit to leave the hospital. As Emily packed her belongings, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She knew the path ahead would be challenging, possibly even dangerous, but she also knew it was necessary, not just for herself, but for the bear, and for all those who sought to understand the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. As she and Jason stood at the hospital exit, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, Emily took a deep breath of fresh air. Are you sure about this? Jason asked one last time. Emily nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. I'm sure. It's time to tell this story, Jason, to bridge the gap between fear and understanding. As they set off towards the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life, Emily felt a sense of purpose settle over her. She had come to Alaska, seeking a profound encounter with nature. She had found it in the most unexpected and terrifying way possible. Now it was time to share that encounter with the world, one photograph at a time. The bear that had once been her nightmare had become her muse, her teacher, her connection to the wild heart of nature. And in that connection, Emily had found not just her story, but her calling. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them, camera in hand, heart open to the wild and beautiful world around her. The steady hum of computers and the occasional crackle of a radio filled the air in the Denali National Park Ranger Station. Ranger Thompson leaned over a large topographical map spread across the central table, his brow furrowed in concentration. Red pins dotted the map, each representing a reported bear sighting or encounter over the past month. Another one here, he muttered, placing a new pin near the area where Emily had her harrowing encounter. That's the third sighting in this sector this week. A younger ranger, Sarah, approached the table. Any pattern to the behavior? Thompson shook his head. Nothing conclusive. Some reports describe the bear as curious but non-aggressive. Others claim it showed threatening behavior. Without visual confirmation, we can't be sure if it's the same animal in all cases. The door to the station swung open, and Emily walked in, camera in hand, with Jason close behind. The rangers looked up, surprise evident on their faces. Ms. Robinson, Thompson said, straightening up. We weren't expecting you back so soon. How are you feeling? Emily managed a small smile. Better, thanks. Still a bit sore, but I'm managing. Her eyes were drawn to the map on the table. Are those all bear sightings? Thompson nodded, his expression grave. I'm afraid so. We've had an unusually high number of encounters in the area where you were attacked. It's becoming a serious concern. Emily moved closer to the map, her heart racing as she took in the cluster of pins near the site of her attack. Have there been any more incidents? Attacks? No attacks, Sarah chimed in. But several close calls. Hikers report the bear approaching. Campsites showing little fear of humans. It's not normal behavior. Jason placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. See? This is why we shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous. But Emily barely heard him. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the gentle curiosity she'd seen in the bear's eyes with the reports of aggressive behavior. What are you planning to do? She asked Thompson. The ranger sighed heavily. We're still assessing the situation, but if the behavior continues, we may have no choice but to euthanize the animal. Emily felt as if she'd been punched in the gut. No, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There has to be another way. Thompson's voice was sympathetic but firm. Ms. Robinson, I understand this is difficult for you, but we have to prioritize public safety. This bear has become habituated to humans, and that makes it extremely dangerous. Emily shook her head, her resolve strengthening. But what if it's not aggression? What if it's just curiosity? You said yourself the reports are inconsistent. Emily, Jason said gently, you can't project human motivations onto a wild animal. What happened with you? It was a fluke. You got lucky. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. She turned to Thompson, her eyes blazing with determination. Let me help. I can document the bear's behavior, provide visual evidence. Maybe if we understand it better, we can find a solution that doesn't involve killing it. The rangers exchanged skeptical glances. Ms. Robinson, Thompson began, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but it's simply too risky. You've already had one near-fatal encounter with this animal. Exactly, Emily countered. I've survived an encounter with it. I have a connection with this bear that no one else does. Please, just give me a chance. A tense silence fell over the room. Finally, Thompson spoke. I can't in good conscience allow you to purposely seek out a potentially dangerous animal. However, he paused, considering his words carefully. If you're determined to stay in the park, we can't stop you. But you'll need to agree to some strict safety protocols. Over the next hour, Emily, Jason, and the rangers hashed out a detailed plan. Emily would be allowed to photograph in the area of the bear sightings, but only with a trained ranger escort. She would undergo additional safety training and carry multiple forms of bear deterrent. Most importantly, she would have to agree to immediately vacate any area if the bear was spotted, no exceptions. As they finalized the details, Emily felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She knew the risks were high, but so were the stakes. This wasn't just about one bear anymore. It was about exploring the complex relationship between humans and wildlife, about finding a way to coexist in a world that was growing ever smaller. The next morning, Emily and Jason set out with Ranger Sarah as their escort. The forest was alive, with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Emily's senses were on high alert, every snapping twig making her heart race. Remember, Sarah said as they hiked, if we spot the bear, we retreat immediately. No heroics, no trying to get the perfect shot. Safety first. Emily nodded, her camera at the ready. They spent hours trekking through the wilderness, following game trails and checking areas of recent bear activity. By mid-afternoon, they had yet to spot the bear. But Emily had captured stunning images of the landscape and other wildlife. As they paused for a water break, a loud crash echoed through the forest. All three froze, eyes scanning the trees. There, Jason whispered, pointing to a clearing about 50 yards away. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The bear stood at the edge of the clearing, its dark fur gleaming in the dappled sunlight. It was larger than she remembered, its presence commanding even at this distance. We need to leave, Sarah said quietly, her hand moving to the bear spray on her belt. Now. But Emily couldn't move. The bear had spotted them, its head tilted in. What looked like curiosity. Slowly it began to approach. Emily, Jason hissed, tugging at her arm. We have to go. Emily raised her camera, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Through the lens, she could see every detail of the bear's face, its eyes deep and intelligent. Hello again, she whispered, almost to herself. The bear paused, sniffing the air. It was close enough now that Emily could hear its heavy breathing. Sarah had her bear spray out, ready to use it at a moment's notice. Ms. Robinson, the ranger said, her voice tense, we are leaving. Right now. But before they could move, the bear did something unexpected. It sat down, much like a dog would, and simply watched them. Emily's finger moved on the shutter button, capturing image after image of this incredible moment. Look, she said softly. It's not aggressive, it's just curious. Jason and Sarah exchanged bewildered glances. This was not typical bear behavior. especially not for an animal that had recently attacked a human. For several long minutes they stood in a surreal standoff with the bear. It made no move to approach further, seemingly content to observe them from its seated position. Emily's camera clicked steadily, documenting every moment. Finally, as if bored with the interaction, the bear stood and ambled back into the forest, disappearing among the trees. The tension broke, and Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "That wasn't afraid, but it wasn't aggressive either. It was like it recognized me." Sarah shook her head, clearly rattled by the encounter. "That was not normal bear behavior. We need to report this immediately." As they hurried back to the ranger station, Emily's mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. She had captured photographic evidence of the bear's unusual behavior, images that could potentially change the way the park approached this situation. Back to you. At the station, Ranger Thompson reviewed the photos with a mix of awe and concern. "This is unprecedented," he admitted. "But it doesn't change the fact that this bear has lost its fear of humans. That makes it dangerous, regardless of its current behavior." Emily felt a surge of frustration. "But don't you see? This bear is different. It's showing a level of intelligence and restraint that goes against everything we assume about these animals. Killing it would be a huge mistake." Thompson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ms. Robinson, I understand your feelings on this, but my job is to protect the people who visit this park. I can't in good conscience ignore the potential threat this animal poses." Emily stood her ground. "Then let me continue to document it. Give me more time to study its behavior, to understand why it's acting this way, please. We might learn something that could change the way we manage human-wildlife interactions in the future." After a long moment, Thompson nodded slowly. "All right. You have 1 week, but if there's any sign of aggression, any at all, we'll have to take action. Understood?" Emily nodded, relief washing over her. As she left the station with Jason, the weight of the responsibility she'd taken on settled on her shoulders. She had 1 week to prove that this bear was more than just a threat, that there was a deeper story here waiting to be told. As the sun set over the Alaskan wilderness, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had come to Denali seeking a profound encounter with nature, and she had found it in the most unexpected way possible. Now, it was up to her to translate that encounter into something that could bridge the gap between human fear and wild beauty. The bear that had once been her nightmare had become her mission, her muse, her key to understanding the complex dance between humans and the natural world. And as she prepared for the challenging week ahead, Emily knew that whatever the outcome, this experience had already changed her life forever. Emily Robinson stood at the edge of the forest, her camera hanging heavy around her neck. The past week had been a whirlwind of close encounters, heated debates with park officials, and moments of profound connection with the wild. Now, as she prepared for what might be her final foray into the bear's territory, she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. "Are you sure about this?" Jason asked, concern etched on his face. Emily nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I have to try, Jason. One last time." As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, Emily's mind raced with memories of her previous encounters, the curious bear watching her from afar, the terrifying chase that ended at the river's edge, the moment of silent communication in the clearing. Each interaction had peeled back another layer of understanding, revealing a creature far more complex than she had ever imagined. The forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife, but Emily's senses were attuned to one particular presence. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of anticipation through her. Was this the moment? Would she see the bear again? Hours passed with no sign of the animal. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Emily's hope began to fade. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps she had failed in her mission to prove the bear's unique nature. Just as they were about to turn back, a low, huffing sound broke the silence. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly she turned, and there it was. The bear stood at the edge of a small clearing, its dark eyes fixed on her. "Hello, old friend," Emily whispered, raising her camera. The bear tilted its head, as if considering her words. It took a step forward, then another. Emily could hear Jason's sharp intake of breath behind her, could sense his hand moving towards the bear spray. But she held up a hand, silently urging him to wait. The tension in the air was palpable, as human and beast regarded each other. Emily's finger hovered over the shutter button, capturing image after image of this extraordinary moment. The bear's eyes seemed to hold a depth of intelligence that took her breath away. "What are you thinking?" she murmured, more to herself than the bear. "What are you trying to tell us?" As if in response, the bear sat down, much like it had during their previous encounter. It made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of fear. It simply watched, curious and calm. Emily's mind raced with the implications of this behavior. This wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct. There was something more here, something that challenged everything. She thought she knew about these creatures. "Do you see?" she said to Jason, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just curiosity. It's like it's trying to communicate." Jason's response was tense, skeptical. "Emily, we can't anthropomorphize. It's still a wild animal, no matter how docile it seems right now." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this interaction than mere animal behavior. She took a careful step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The bear watched her, unmoving. "I'm not going to hurt you," Emily said softly. "I'm trying to understand you, to help others understand you." For a moment, it seemed as though the bear truly comprehended her words. Its eyes, deep and intelligent, remained fixed on her face. Then, with a soft huff, it rose to its feet and ambled back into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Emily let out a shaky breath, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She turned to Jason, her eyes shining with excitement and wonder. "Did you see that? Did you feel it? There's something special about this bear, Jason. We can't let them kill it." As they made their way back to the ranger station, Emily's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had captured extraordinary footage, moments of interaction that defied conventional understanding of bear behavior. But would it be enough? Ranger Thompson listened to their account with a mix of fascination and concern. He reviewed the photographs, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is unprecedented," he admitted. "But Ms. Robinson, you have to understand, no matter how docile this bear appears, it's still a wild animal that has lost its fear of humans. That makes it inherently dangerous." Emily felt a surge of frustration. "But that's just it," she argued. "What if it's not about fear? What if it's about understanding? This bear has had multiple opportunities to attack, but it hasn't. It's showing a level of restraint and intelligence that we've never seen before." So, debate raged on into the night. Emily presented her case with passion and conviction, drawing on every observation, every moment of connection she had experienced over the past week. She spoke of the bear's curious gaze, its calm demeanor in their presence, the way it seemed to respond to her words. "We have a unique opportunity here," she insisted. "A chance to study a level of animal intelligence we've barely scratched the surface of. Killing this bear would be more than just a tragedy. It would be a massive scientific loss." As the discussion wound down, Ranger Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've given us a lot to consider, Ms. Robinson. I can't make any promises, but we'll take your observations into account before making a final decision." It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a glimmer of hope. As Emily left the station, exhausted but determined, she felt a sense of connection to the wilderness around her that she had never experienced before. She had come to Denali seeking a profound encounter with nature, and she had found it in the most unexpected way possible. The bear that had once been her nightmare had become her mission, her key to understanding the complex relationship between humans and the wild world around them. Whatever the outcome, Emily knew that this experience had changed her forever. As she prepared for bed that night, Emily's thoughts drifted to the bear somewhere out there in the vast Alaskan wilderness. "We're not so different, you and I," she murmured to the darkness. "We're both just trying to survive, to understand each other in this big, wild world." The days that followed were a blur of meetings, presentations, and heated discussions. Emily presented her findings to a panel of wildlife experts, arguing passionately for a new approach to managing human-wildlife interactions. She spoke of The bear's intelligence, its restraint, the moments of seeming communication they had shared. "We have a responsibility," she told the panel, her voice filled with conviction. "Not just to protect ourselves, but to protect and understand these magnificent creatures. This bear has shown us that there's so much more to learn, so much more to explore in our relationship with the wild." As she waited for the panel's decision, Emily found herself drawn back to the forest. She stood at the edge of the tree line, her camera in hand, scanning the wilderness for any sign of her ursine companion. "Where are you?" she whispered to the wind. "Are you out there wondering about me too?" The forest remained silent, offering no answers. But as Emily turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement in the underbrush. For a brief moment, she locked eyes with the bear, its gaze as curious and intelligent as ever. In that instant, Emily knew that regardless of the panel's decision, her work was far from over. She had been given a rare gift, a glimpse into the complex inner world of a creature long misunderstood. It was her responsibility now to share that understanding, to bridge the gap between human fear and wild beauty. As the bear disappeared into the forest, Emily raised her camera one last time. The shutter clicked, capturing not just an image, but a promise. A promise to continue learning, to continue exploring, to continue fighting for a world where humans and wildlife could coexist in harmony and mutual understanding. The journey that had begun with terror had transformed into something profound, a quest for knowledge, for connection, for a deeper appreciation of the wild world and our place within it. And as Emily made her way back to civilization, she carried with her not just photographs and memories, but a new purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to truly encounter the wild.